Welcome to Lecture 2 for Bright Old Testament 510, the historical books. In this particular lecture, we'll be looking at 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So let's dive in.
The question that immediately confronts us as we begin 1st and 2nd Samuel is, why are there two Samuels? There's not two Judges or two Joshuas. The answer has to do with the Hebrew text. Hebrew fits on one scroll for Samuel. In Greek, however, it does not fit on one scroll, but takes two scrolls. So when the Septuagint translated the Hebrew into Greek, it labeled 1st and 2nd Samuel, or the Samuel scroll, as 1st and 2nd Kingdoms. Our 1st and 2nd Kings was labeled as 3rd and 4th Kingdoms. When the Latin Vulgate was translated, the designation remained the same. However, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kingdoms became 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Kings, with 1st and Samuel being 1st and 2nd Kings. In 1517, in the Bomberg Bible, the English translation divided 1st and 2nd Samuel from 1st and 2nd Kings and gave them the labels that we still use today. Today, it is customary for both Christian and Jewish traditions to label them as 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Who wrote 1st and 2nd Samuel? We honestly do not know. It seems as though the authors of 1st and 2nd Samuel stand outside of 1st and 2nd Samuel and are reporting on the history of the book rather than being characters within the stories. However, this doesn't give us much of an indication as to when they would have written, because we aren't completely sure as to why they wrote. Was the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel being written as an instruction manual to later rulers in Israel, since much of the book focuses on the proper behavior of prophets, priests, kings, and even warriors? Or is the book written during the days of Solomon, meant to be a defense of the Davidic line? Or perhaps even later in the time of Rehoboam, after Jeroboam has divided from the southern kingdom, forming the northern kingdom of Israel that became known as Samaria? Is it possible that the books were written as a defense, trying to call the northern kingdom back to the southern kingdom and the Davidic line? Really, the question of who wrote 1st and 2nd Samuel relies heavily upon when and why the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel was written. And since we don't have any definitive answers to those questions, we don't really have a definitive answer to who wrote 1st and 2nd Samuel either. Given the theories of the Deuteronomistic history, it has often been thought that 1st and 2nd Samuel were written after the exile, written by the Deuteronomist. However, Martin Note, the original theorist behind the Deuteronomistic history, suggests that 1st and 2nd Samuel only show slight evidence of editing, in that the Deuteronomist would have left 1st and 2nd Samuel largely the way he found them, because of the fact that they already made all the emphases that he wished to make. In that sense, 1st and 2nd Samuel, even according to those who hold to the Deuteronomistic history, goes back to a time early on in the monarchy, even if it was redacted later, according to the theory. However, Bruce Halpern has suggested, based on archaic language and some of the details that exist within 1st and 2nd Samuel, that the books were written in the time of Solomon, or perhaps shortly thereafter. We have some defective Hebrew words that are used throughout the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. We don't have a lot of mater lectionis, which is often a sign of later Hebraic writing. Instead, we have words that are written in that defective state without the mater lectionis. We also have some details related to the geography of Israel that are quite odd, given the later developments that took place in Israel. Those details would fit earlier with the more archaic understanding of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel being written early on in Israel's monarchy. The writer of 1st and 2nd Samuel would have simply been relating the details of his day without even thinking about the fact that those would soon be outdated. All of this suggests that 1st and 2nd Samuel may have been written fairly early, during the time of perhaps even David, since David is alive at the end of 2nd Samuel, or in the days of Solomon, or in the days of Rehoboam. Again, we simply don't know, but it does seem as though the books are quite old.
We have a similar question related to 1st and 2nd Kings. When was 1st and 2nd Kings written? Who wrote 1st and 2nd Kings? If it was written by one person, then it would seem that it was written after the exile, since the book of 2nd Kings ends with the people headed off into exile, perhaps written during the exile or shortly thereafter. If it's a composite based upon other books, such as the book of the Acts of Solomon that is mentioned within 1st and 2nd Kings, or the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, or the Chronicles of the King of Israel, neither of which seem to be the book of Chronicles that we have in our English Bibles, then it's anyone's guess, because any of those sources could have been used and redacted into a single version, or the book itself may be a combination of the work of separate authors. In other words, we really don't have any idea when 1st and 2nd Kings was written, although it seems logical that it was written, or at least redacted and edited, after the end of the reign of the kings of Judah at the end of 2nd Kings, suggesting that it was in the time of exile or perhaps after the time of exile. That's the closest that we can get. As to who accomplished this, well, again, everybody says it was the Deuteronomist, but again, as we've already seen in 1st and 2nd Samuel, the Deuteronomist seemed, if he existed, to have taken a book that needed very little editing and have added it to his history. So even if the Deuteronomist was an editor that was redacting and putting together the works from Joshua through the book of 2nd Kings, and perhaps even into Ezra and Nehemiah, then we have a lot of different sources by a lot of different authors.
Samuel and Judges have a lot in common. And the big question that we're facing as we come to the end of the book of Judges is, are we at the end of a cycle? Are we at the end of the cycle? Are we no longer on that crazy cycle that's found in the Judges of the people leaving God and then being punished and then crying out to God for a deliverer and then God raising up a judge and then the judge serving until he dies and then once he dies, the people apostatizing? As we open the book of 1 Samuel, we have a situation of a judge. However, we don't have a righteous judge, and we don't have a warrior judge. Instead, we have a high priest who is judging and is doing a very bad job of it. He apparently doesn't know what praying people look like as he sees Hannah at the temple. He doesn't notice that his sons are doing heinous things, or if he does notice, he chooses not to notice. He's turning his back on the sin of priests and the sin of his sons, when they should be removed, in fact, even executed for stealing the Lord's sacrifices. So we have a bad judge here, which gives us the impression that we have simply continued the trajectory, starting again at Othniel, all the way down through Samson, passing through the situation with Gibeah and the destruction of Benjamin, and going right on into Eli, so that as the book opens, it doesn't seem that much has changed. And then when Eli dies, the question is, does the cycle continue? Are we going to wait for another judge to be raised up? Or is Samuel that other judge? Perhaps, as the people are following after Samuel and defeating the Philistines in 1 Samuel chapter 7, perhaps the people have finally turned to God and the cycle is ended, and yet when we get to chapter 8 and they request a king, we're perplexed. Does this mean that the cycle is continuing? It seems, as we come to the end of the life of Eli and the end of the life of Samuel, that we're seeing the end of a cycle, and we're expecting the people to apostatize and for the cycle to simply continue. So what is the relationship then between Samuel and Judges, between Samuel and the cycle of the Judges? Are we to understand Samuel as simply continuing that process so that we see a cycle no longer of the Judges but now a cycle of the kings? Or are we supposed to understand the kings as ending the cycle? This is an interpretive question and a very important one as we determine what is the relationship of David to that cycle, because when David and Solomon fall away from God, they lead the whole nation away from God. David leads the people back, but we don't see any indication that Solomon repents at the end of his lifetime and comes back to God. And then we see a continuation of this cycle all the way through 2 Kings. So where does the cycle end? Does it end? This is a major question as we examine Samuel. Is Samuel the end of the cycle? Is David the end of the cycle? Is the cycle complete? Or does the cycle keep going?
The most obvious connection between the book of Samuel and the book of Judges is the phrase at the end of Judges, "There was no king in those days." It would imply that there is a king now. And since the end of Judges understands that there is going to be Saul of Gibeah, it would seem as though it is looking forward to the time of kings. That Judges is actually written when there are kings, or perhaps even after there were kings, if it's written in the exile, although we've already made the argument that Samuel is fairly early in the time of the monarchy, and thus it would suggest that Judges is fairly close to that same time frame. However, it doesn't tell us which king the book of Judges is written under. It does, though, suggest that there is a king coming and anticipate that, even though the first 8 chapters of the book of Samuel do not mention a king. Actually, they do mention a king because they make the argument that the king has always been Yahweh, which is really the end of the book of Judges as well. Yahweh was supposed to be king, as Gideon said. Yahweh was king of Israel, so that when Israel asks for an actual king, a physical king, a king in those days, they're actually rejecting Yahweh as king. But that connection between Samuel and Judges is made by that statement. There is no king in those days, but then as 1 Samuel opens, we're anticipating there is a king coming.
If we understand the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and Judges as being closely related, we're left with the question of why the book of Judges even ends the way it does. Up through chapter 16, we're going steadily downhill until we get to the end of Samson's life. And then in 17 through 21, we have the interesting stories of the Levite and the destruction of the tribe of Benjamin, as well as the fact that they are kidnapping women from Shiloh, which is where the Ark of the Covenant is located. And then as we begin in 1 Samuel, we see several of these same concepts return. Saul is from Gibeah, as we find out in chapter 10. The Ark of the Covenant is still in Shiloh, at least in chapters 1 through 4, and we have a certain man from the hill country. Elkanah is referred to that way. Saul passes through the hill country of Ephraim, as well as Nabal, the fool, who is in the hill country of Ephraim, reminding us of the certain man from the hill country of Ephraim at the end of the book of Judges, the Levite with the concubine, which sparks the whole situation with the devoting to destruction of the tribe of Benjamin. So again, we have all of these connections deliberately made between the end of the book of Judges and the beginning of 1 Samuel. So why end the book of Judges where it ends and start 1 Samuel? We don't really have a definitive answer to this question, other than the fact that 1st and 2nd Samuel seem to be bookended by a poem. So in 1 Samuel chapter 2, we see the bookend of Hannah's prayer, and at the end of 2 Samuel, we see the other bookend of David's prayer. So again, we do have a description and a definition of the fact that we have two books, but we do have an interesting connection between the book of Samuel and the book of Judges, as we see these many separate themes that are connected between the two books. Again, raising in our minds the question of how we interpret 1 Samuel, we must interpret it with Judges in mind, as much as we have in mind of where we're going in 1 Kings. Thus, the temple explains much that goes on in 1 and 2 Samuel, but the book of Judges also explains what goes on in 1 and 2 Samuel. There's a reason why the book of Judges ends the way it does, as though it's anticipating 1 and 2 Samuel, and there's a reason why 1 and 2 Samuel uses the phrase that it does and starts out the way that it does, giving the impression that it is simply a continuation of the book of Judges. This is deliberate, both in an effort to show that it is similar to the book of Judges and that the cycle is similarly continuing, but also to show that it's distinct from Judges, so that you recall the book of Judges but then see something different as taking place in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel.
Not only do we have to ask the question, why stop here at the end of the book of Judges, but why stop here at the end of 2 Kings? 2 Kings chapter 24 and the offering of sacrifices at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, the future site of the temple, assumes that there's going to be a temple. But does that mean that 2 Samuel 24 is written during the time of the temple, or shortly after the temple? Or does 2 Samuel simply know that there's going to be a temple on that location? Not to mention the fact that 2 Samuel ends with David not dead. Why is there no mention of a successor? Why is there no explicit explanation of Solomon being the one who will follow after David? We have bookends of the songs in 1 Samuel 2 and 2 Samuel 23 that tell us for sure that this is indeed the structure of Samuel. Samuel is what it is. It's not running into the book of Kings. It doesn't start earlier in the book of Judges. It is its own self-contained unit. But we're still left with the question of why. It's not the style of Kings. It's different than the style of Judges, although there's more similarity perhaps with Judges than with Kings. But still, why end here? In that sense, as we ask that question at the end of Judges, we have to read Judges in light of 1 Samuel and 1 Samuel in light of Judges. We also have to read 2 Samuel in light of Kings.
The structure of 1st and 2nd Samuel is fairly agreed upon within scholarship. What is not agreed upon is how the structure came to be. Many people have suggested over the last several decades, in fact over the last century, using source criticism and other forms of criticism of 1st and 2nd Samuel, that the structure is based upon ancient documents which were pulled together to form 1st and 2nd Samuel. Thus, we have David's rise in 1 Samuel 16 through 2 Samuel 1, this being a document, and then the succession document being 2 Samuel chapter 9, or sometimes chapter 8, 9, or 10, depending on who's dividing it, up through 2 Kings chapter 2, who it is that's going to succeed David. However, there is no reason to suggest that there are actual documents that traveled independently of one another that were then pulled together. What's clear is that the writer of 1st and 2nd Samuel is using sources. In fact, he's probably even using Samuel and some of Samuel's writings, which are referenced at least once in the book, as a source, as well as probably the records of Gad and Nathan. So to say that it's using sources is not out of the question. To suggest that these particular narratives were separate books that have then been pulled together is probably taking it a little far. I've divided the book up slightly differently, not so much with different divisions, but just calling them something different. So in 1 Samuel chapter 1 through chapter 8, we have pre-Saul, really the transition between the book of Judges and the first king. And then we have Saul's rise and fall in 1 Samuel 9 through 15, and really 9 through 15 and then to the end of the chapter. But we have David's rise in 1 Samuel 16 through 2 Samuel 1 that overlaps Saul's fall. We then have David's reign from 2 Samuel chapter 1 or 2, really through the end of 2 Samuel, but to divide it up, I've put it through 2 Samuel 8, 9, or 10, give or take, with David's fall being in 2 Samuel 11, and then the ensuing travesties that occur within his family from chapter 11 through chapter 21. And then we do have David's replacement or the succession narrative from 2 Samuel chapter 9 through 2 Kings chapter 2. Again, this is a loose structure, a loose outline of the book. There are probably other ways that it could be outlined, but this seems to be the major structure of the book. Just as in Judges we had 3 sections, a prologue, as it were, then the reign of the judges, and then the postlogue. Here we have the prologue being before Saul, then Saul, David, and then the book ends rather abruptly at the end in 2 Samuel chapter 24 with the dedication of the threshing floor of the Jebusite, Araunah. We don't really find the succession until 2 Kings chapter 1 or 2, but that's why I've connected it here with David's replacement. There in chapter 1 and 2, we find out that Solomon is the replacement, which we kind of knew all along because when Solomon was born, he was called Jedediah, or the Lord's beloved. We're really going to focus on the first 8 chapters of Samuel for our lecture today, the era pre-Saul. Again, this is the era that takes us from the last judge, being Samson, through Eli, and then after Eli's death to Samuel, and then after Samuel to his sons. Although we're told that his sons are wicked, it's not likely that his sons were necessarily national judges because they're serving alongside their father. Samuel is serving in Ramah in the north in the hill country of Ephraim. The 2 sons, Joel and Abiah, are actually serving in Beersheba, which is all the way in the south of Israel. And yet the elders still seem to understand that when Samuel is gone, that the sons are going to step into that position of judge. So there is some national aspect of it, even though they're serving as a local judge in the south. Samuel, of course, is asked to appoint a king in 1 Samuel chapter 8, which brings us then to the monarchy, which begins in chapter 9 and following. There's 2 themes that are primarily mentioned in the first couple chapters of Samuel. One has to do with glory. That is, those that glorify God, God will glorify. Again, the word is kavod, which means heavy or weighty or glorious, shiny, literally. It has a number of different meanings, and there's a number of play on words in the first couple of chapters because of this word kavod. Eli is told that he will not receive glory because he has not given glory to God. Instead, he has despised God by choosing his sons over God. But we're told in chapter 3 that Eli is a heavy man, kavod, not meaning that he's full of glory, but meaning that he's fat. He's so fat that when he falls off of his chair, he dies. We're also told about the glory of Dagon versus the glory of Yahweh in the chapters that deal with the Ark of the Covenant going to Philistia. And there the elders of Philistia say that they should not harden their hearts as the Egyptians did, which again is that word kavod. Don't make your hearts heavy. Don't harden your hearts. So we have a number of plays on words there in the first couple of chapters using this word kavod and its various translations. Again, that constant emphasis upon kavod, 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 which then fades away and we don't see it again until 1 Samuel 15, where Saul is very concerned about his personal kavod for defeating the enemies of God. We also have an emphasis in these chapters on seeing, really a lack of seeing. Elkanah does not see what's going on in his own family and the tension that is being caused there. Eli does not see that Hannah is praying. Eli does not see what his sons are doing. Eli does not see when the messenger returns from the battle after the Ark of the Covenant has been captured. Samuel does not see what his sons are doing. Israel does not see what is going on. Neither do the Philistines when their god Dagon ends up having his head cut off and his arms cut off. Not his legs because he has a tail, he's a giant fish, but has his arms and his head cut off and placed on the threshold of their temple. They still don't see what is going on. So we have this ongoing emphasis upon seeing and a lack of seeing, all the way up through chapter 8, where Israel does not see what they have as king in God and what they have as judge in Samuel. So again, an emphasis upon seeing. This introduces these two themes that will really last through the entire book, that there are people who cannot see and there are people who do not understand glory, and those two play hand in hand. Within the first couple chapters of 1 Samuel, we see a complete reversal. This is very common within the Old Testament, but especially within 1 Samuel, where those who are low are exalted. Again, God says, "Those who glorify me, I will exalt, I will glorify, I will honor." And those who choose to honor themselves, God belittles, God brings low. We have at the beginning of 1 Samuel an emphasis upon the Elides, or the Elides, I suppose we could say. These are the descendants of Eli, just like we will later on refer to the Omrides to talk about the descendants of King Omri in northern Israel. The Eli line, or the Elides, are going to end because Eli has despised God, and his sons have certainly despised God, taking the sacrifices that they were not supposed to take. They were supposed to be cut off or executed for what they had done, but Eli chooses to turn a blind eye, just simply warning them a time or two. And God again emphasizes that idea of seeing by saying that those who descend from Eli will instead weep their eyes out, that their eyes will fail because of all of their weeping in the future. And eventually, at the end of David's reign, this is going to come to pass as Abiathar is no longer the priest. Instead, Solomon sets up a new high priest and sends Abiathar home, thus ending the line of Eli as priests. The grand reversal, though, that takes place here is that Hannah has no children. Her rival, Peninnah, does have children, and she says that she has been exalted, Hannah has been exalted, suggesting that Peninnah has been brought low, but not so much that Peninnah has lost all of her children, but simply that Peninnah has been humbled as she's been mocking Hannah. Now the mockery has been proved to be useless because now Hannah will have children. She will actually have 6 children, Samuel plus 5 more. But really, her emphasis within the song that she sings in 1 Samuel chapter 2 is the fact that the descendants of Eli are going to be brought low, while the descendants of Hannah, that is Samuel, are going to be exalted. So even though this is all started with a glorious future for the descendants of Eli, it is going to be taken. And even though Hannah feels like she has very little future because of the fact that she has no children, she is going to have a glorious future because she will be remembered for all time. It's worth noting that Elkanah, her husband, is completely clueless as to what's going on, and he is not mentioned for all time. He disappears after chapter 2. Hannah's faith is fairly remarkable in these first couple chapters. Not only does she go and pray, not only does she make vows, not only does she bring sacrifices, basically doing all the things that her husband was supposed to do, she specifically requests a son. She wants a man child or a child of men because she believes that Samuel is the answer to the leadership vacuum in Israel. Remember, there is no king in those days, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Hannah specifically mentions a king in 1 Samuel chapter 2, perhaps prophetically speaking ahead of David. She doesn't think that her son is going to be king because she gives him to God. He's going to be a priest, not a king, even though he functions as a judge. But she understands that Samuel is part of the future of Israel and part eventually of the kingship, as he will anoint the first two kings of Israel, Saul and David. So we see the grand reversal that takes place here. We see the lack of seeing on Eli's part, not seeing what his sons are doing, and being brought low because of it. We also see a grand reversal then in the story of the Philistines, which we'll get to in just a moment. 1 Samuel chapter 3 is often called the call of Samuel. However, you will notice as you read 1 Samuel chapter 3 that there is no mention as to what Samuel is ever supposed to do. We infer that something must have happened in the conversation, or that somehow Samuel came to understand that he was supposed to be the priest, he was supposed to be the prophet, as the chapter ends saying that none of the words of Samuel ever fell to the ground, and people understood that God spoke through Samuel, which is a change of the way things were going in Israel, because the chapter begins by telling us that the word was rare in those days and there was no frequent vision. And yet by the end, God is appearing to Samuel at Shiloh and revealing himself there so that the word of the Lord comes to Israel. The call, though, is not so much a call throughout 1 Samuel chapter 3 as much as it is a call to repentance to Eli, to see what his sons are doing. It's the second such call. Again, the word of the Lord is rare in those days, and yet here, twice, we see the word of the Lord come to Eli, trying to get his attention. Of course, it doesn't work, and the situation goes from bad to worse as Eli gives permission for the Ark of the Covenant to be carried into battle in 1 Samuel chapter 4, where it is subsequently captured. The Israelites thought that they could manipulate God by bringing the Ark of the Covenant, the earthly throne of God, into battle, assuming that because God goes where the ark goes, if the ark is in danger, God will protect himself and protect Israel. Of course, it doesn't work that way, and thousands of them die, and the Ark of the Covenant goes into captivity in Philistia. So all of this has brought about the fulfillment of the word that comes to Samuel, warning him about what's going to happen to Eli. But again, it's not just for Samuel's sake, it's really for Eli's sake to call him to repentance. Unfortunately, it is a call that is completely ignored, and he and his sons die on the same day, as does his daughter-in-law, as she dies in birth. At the end of 1 Samuel chapter 4, the Ark of the Covenant is captured and goes into captivity and begins to wreak havoc on the Philistines, really showing them that their God is worthless. Ironically, they don't turn from their God. They're concerned that God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, is beating up on their God, but they actually continue to serve Dagon. In fact, rather than seeing that their God is worthless because he lost his head and his hands, they decide superstitiously not to step on the threshold where the head and the hands had ended up after they were removed. Eventually, they are struck with such plagues. The word is often translated as tumors or hemorrhoids. Really, it is something in the nether regions of the male anatomy that prohibits them from having children. There have been all sorts of different theories, some of them quite graphic. Basically, they're not able to do what they normally do to have children because of their pain and their suffering and their agony, as well as a plague that has come out and just struck people dead. Not to mention the fact that by the end of the chapter, we see the Ark of the Covenant affecting Israel as well. So the Ark of the Covenant's glory, again, that major theme is being emphasized here, both for the people of Israel and for the Philistines. The Philistines first figure it out. They repent. They offer a sacrifice, a burnt offering, a atoning sacrifice, and send back the Ark of the Covenant to Israel, where it ends up in Beth Shemesh. They send it back with golden mice and golden tumors, or golden hemorrhoids. Again, an odd thing, but in keeping with what had struck them. Perhaps these are golden statues of male organs, which were very common in the ancient Near East, and it's possible that was what was in the Ark of the Covenant alongside these mice. God has struck the fertility of Philistia. They can't have crops because of the mice. They can't have children because of the hemorrhoids or whatever the nether regions are doing in Philistia. And so they realize that Dagon, who is a god of fertility, is actually being destroyed by the God of Israel. So what better thing to do than get rid of it? They put the Ark of the Covenant on a cart, they send it off where it ends up in Beth Shemesh, which again reminds us that we saw Beth Shemesh back at the beginning of Judges, although this is a different Beth Shemesh. That one was in Naphtali. This one is closer to Judah, near Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant comes back, and the people there in Beth Shemesh look in it and are struck dead, apparently thinking that because the Ark of the Covenant didn't defend them in battle, it must have no power. God has demonstrated, though, his glory and his power both in Philistia and in Israel. Eventually, the Ark of the Covenant is sent off to a priest's house, where it will remain for the next 20 years. 1 Samuel chapter 7 is a cycle of repentance that looks very much like Judges chapter 10. It is a sincere repentance as the people put away their idols and turn back to God. They then go out and defeat the Philistines who have come to attack them at Mizpah, and Samuel sets up his very famous Ebenezer, his rock of help, the monument reminding Israel of the fact that God has delivered them. God thunders against the Philistines. Again, Dagon, being a god of fertility, would have been understood to be a god of thunder. So it's ironic that God destroys the Philistines with their own weapon, with thunder, showing that he is over the thunder, not Dagon. Dagon being an inferior fertility god of the Philistines. Some people have tried to connect Dagon with Baal or Dagon with El or some other god, but basically he's a fertility war god, very common in the ancient Near East and associated with clouds and thunder and lightning, just like God uses when he descends on Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. Once the Ark of the Covenant has come back, it has stayed at the priest's house for about 20 years, and the people of Israel began to mourn, and they began to cry out to God for deliverance from their enemies. But just like in Judges chapter 10, they do so sincerely. At least we think it's sincerely, and we get the impression that they were sincere and that this repentance stuck, as it were, from that time until the time in 1 Samuel chapter 8 when Samuel grows old. So if we assume that Samuel was a young child in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and 3 when the Ark of the Covenant goes into captivity, it's in captivity for 7 months and then 20 years, and then Samuel is coming and doing the sacrifice as they go out to defeat the Philistines in chapter 7. So perhaps Samuel is only in his 20s or 30s at this point, and then when we get to chapter 8, he's old. I'll let you decide how old is. I picture somebody really old, although Samuel still has some spunk left. He's not so old that he can't do anything. He still has more to do after chapter 8. But in chapter 8, he is old, so we've had quite a bit of time that has passed from chapter 7 to chapter 8, and the people do not appear to have fallen away. So we're beginning to get hints of the fact that the cycle that we saw in the book of Judges is breaking to a point. The cycle will come back, unfortunately, and it will degrade to the point that Israel ends up in exile, both in the north and in the south, and yet, at least for a time, at least through the reign of Saul, the reign of David, and part of the reign of Solomon, Israel is following after God. Saul, for all of his spiritual incompetencies, which we'll look at in our next few lectures, still does not lead Israel into idolatry, doesn't lead them towards following other gods. Instead, one way or another, although he seems to not have an elevator that quite goes to the top spiritually, he still emphasizes the worship of God and still gets them to make vows to God and to follow after God, even though it's clear that he's a spiritual moron. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, we see the request for a king. This is a real slap in the face to Samuel, but ultimately a slap in the face to God, because God is the king of Israel. That's been the whole point through the book of Judges, and even though Gideon doesn't seem to have fully understood his statement when he said he would not be king, the emphasis has been on these judges serving as God's right hand, but God ultimately being the king. Really, when David becomes king, we're actually going back to that arrangement, although we're going to have a title and we're going to have a warrior, but there's still an emphasis on the fact that God is the king, and that the king, as in Psalm 2, is his anointed one, his son, who is going to do his bidding, but still it is ultimately God who is in control. Again, this was the point back in Judges all the way through 1 Samuel up until this point, and yet Israel has not been paying attention. They don't see that God fights through Samuel. that God has thundered against the Philistines once. He'll do so again in chapter 12. They don't see that Samuel still has some spunk left, as in chapter 15 he kills Agag, the king of the Amalekites. They've rejected their judge who speaks for God because they want to have somebody they can see. They want to have somebody who will fight their battles for them rather than trusting in God. They want a warrior, and they do get a warrior, one who's head and shoulders taller than all the people, one who is impressive, a physical specimen, and one who has the spiritual competency of a 2-year-old. Saul is devoid of any spiritual maturity for his entire lifetime, and yet the people get exactly what they want. In fact, as we will see in chapter 1, as Hannah is praying, she repeatedly uses the word Sha'al, meaning to ask. This is the one that I asked for. And yet she doesn't name Samuel Saul, which would be in keeping with Sha'al, asked for. She names him Samuel, which may mean God has purposed or God has set, or perhaps a amalgamation of God has heard. But eventually, when we get to Saul, the king that they asked for, that they requested, Sha'al, we get Sha'ul, we get Saul. And he is everything the people want. And they begin to realize that that's not what they really wanted. That's not what they really needed. They actually had it better under Samuel. Samuel warns them in 1 Samuel 8 of all that the king is going to do to them. He warns them that they're going to regret their decision, and yet they simply won't listen. 1 Samuel chapter 8 is very interesting in the fact that God had already spoken of a king earlier in Deuteronomy, and so it's likely that God was eventually going to give them a king either way. However, in their sinfulness, they have asked with a bad reasoning, rejecting God as king. They have asked rejecting Samuel, and they've basically asked on their own timing for their own purposes. They want a king that will be their figurehead and whom they can manipulate. And the ending of this is going to be disastrous. Saul will not be the man after God's own heart. Saul will be the man after Saul's heart. And ultimately, it will be David that will be the man after God's own heart, who will be the king that God desires. One wonders if God actually gave them Saul as a punishment, and had they simply waited, would they have had David without Saul? One can only conjecture because we do have Saul, but it is clear that the people have sinned in asking for this king, as Samuel will point out in 1 Samuel 12. They have asked for a king sinfully, but they're going to get exactly what they asked for, which is a terrifying thought. The portion of 1 Samuel that we're going to look at today goes from chapter 8 all the way through 2 Samuel chapter 5. The rise of the kingship really begins in chapter 8 as the people of Israel reject the idea of Samuel as judge and request a king. God acquiesces to their sinful request and gives them a king. Although he doesn't give them the king that they need, he gives them the king they ask for. Thus, Saul's name is appropriate, Shaul meaning requested one, or the one who is asked for, and Shaul meaning please give me something, or a request. And so here the people, Shaul, they ask, they request a king, and they are given Shaul. They're given what they asked for. As we saw last week, what they asked for is not good, and God gives them something that's not overly good, until he's ready to send them the man after his own heart, to send them King David. The narrative will follow Saul from chapter 9 all the way through the end of 1 Samuel, at which point Samuel will die in chapter 25, Saul will die in chapter 31 alongside all of his sons, and then in chapter 1 his body will be recovered by the men of Jabesh Gilead. David will reign in Hebron after the death of Saul, because the followers of Saul will take Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and make him king instead, since all of his brothers died in the battle back in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel against the Philistines. Ishbosheth will take over. Ishbosheth's name is probably Ishbaal, meaning man of the Lord, man of the master, man of the husband, literally. This makes a whole lot more sense than Ishbosheth, which means man of shame. The Old Testament is pretty well known for changing names, especially those who put themselves as enemies to Israel. Thus, even the devil's name, Beelzebul, is changed to Beelzebub, from the Lord of the harvest to the Lord of flies, hence the name of the famous book, The Lord of the Flies. This will be our overview of 1 Samuel then today as we look at chapters 8 through chapter 31 and then on into 2 Samuel. Chapters 9 and 10 are fairly fascinating. There's a lot of information in these two chapters, some of which we simply skim over out of habit as we're reading through 1st and 2nd Samuel, since we know the story. Saul goes to get donkeys, but it turns out that this is providential, as he's meant to go to Ramah to see Samuel. Samuel has set aside a special portion for him, knowing that he was coming, even though Saul didn't know he was coming. Samuel knows because he's been told by God. He's been warned ahead of time that Saul is coming. And Samuel is going to anoint Saul as king over all Israel. However, Saul is a very reluctant hero. So there are actually 3 times that Saul is selected as king. This being the first one, God himself has selected the king and said, "This is the king. You are to follow him." It helps that Saul, we're told, is taller than anybody else in his culture. It also helps that he is more handsome than anybody in his culture, as he's said to be good, tov, not a reflection of his spiritual goodness, but a reflection of his physical goodness, that he is tov, or better than anybody else in Israel. So Saul is the great choice that the people are going to choose in the next chapter, but for now God chooses him and has Samuel anoint him. Even though we find out in 1 Samuel chapter 10 that Saul has been anointed as king, 1 Samuel chapter 10 is also an indication that something is not quite right with Saul. That again, his elevator doesn't quite go to the top spiritually. We see some issues here in the text because Samuel tells Saul who he's going to meet on the way back to Gibeah. And he's told that he should, there in verse 7, "When these signs meet you, do what your hand finds to do, for God is with you." Remembering, of course, there in verse 6 that we are told that there is a garrison of the Philistines in Gibeah. So the expectation is, especially when the Spirit of God rushes upon him, as we saw several times within the book of Judges, whether it be Othniel, whether it be Samson or Jephthah, as the Spirit of God rushes upon a person, they usually act. They usually do something. And yet here is Saul in verse 6 going back to Gibeah, where there is a garrison. The Spirit of God is going to rush upon him, and he's going to do absolutely nothing. Instead, he goes home. He doesn't even tell his father about becoming king. Instead, he goes home. He doesn't fight the garrison. He doesn't call out the troops. He doesn't even go and attempt to parley and bargain with them. He just simply ignores them. Great. So there's a garrison of troops there in Gibeah. So what? At the end of his reign, he could probably say the same thing. There is still a garrison of troops in Gibeah. Saul, the text seems to imply, was meant to drive out those troops, but he does not. He does not drive them out. He leaves them there, again, as a snare, but again, the fact that he had the opportunity to deliver Israel, and he does not. Instead, we'll have to wait till the next couple chapters to find out what exactly Saul is going to do to deliver the Israelites. The rest of 1 Samuel chapter 10 and following continues the theme that there is something off about Saul. He just simply doesn't do what he's supposed to do the way that you would expect a king to do it. Remember, the king, according to the people in chapter 8, was supposed to go before them and lead their battles. However, when they decide on this second occasion to anoint Saul as king, they can't find him. And it turns out that he's hiding. He's hiding in the bushes because he's scared. Not really exactly the kind of guy who's going to fill you with terror as you find out that the king before you used to hide under his bed when he was scared. So here we have Saul hiding among the baggage, not being willing to be anointed king. They go, they take him, they make him the king, and not everybody wants to follow him, which is understandable since, again, he was hiding. Although we're told that these are worthless fellows who will not follow him. These worthless fellows using the same word as describes Eli's sons back in chapter 2, worthless. So these men are men who say Saul should not be king, although they're going to change their mind because we see Saul deliver the town of Jabesh-Gilead when it is under attack, and when the men of Jabesh-Gilead say that we should put to death those who said Saul should not be king, Saul wisely averts a disaster. We've been down this road before, killing off Israelites. The tension that existed between Gideon and Ephraim, and then between Jephthah and Ephraim, and now here Here we see the cycle broken, that Saul does not get revenge. Instead, Saul says, no, we're going to rejoice this day. There is no need for revenge, and allows those men to be accepted back into the fold of Israel, which is very wise on his part. We're kind of left scratching our heads of how in the world did somebody make such a wise decision without having impact of Scripture, any impact of the law in his life, and yet he wisely doesn't say anything. He allows it to be smoothed over so that there is no division within Israel. Again, this is the second of three narratives of Saul becoming king. We're going to see the third one after he delivers the town of Jabesh Gilead, as he delivers them from the Ammonites, and as the people say at that point, let's go and make him king. In chapter 11, Nahash the Ammonite attacks the city of Jabesh Gilead. Men of Jabesh Gilead asked for permission to find somebody to defend them. Not really sure why the Ammonites decide that that's a good idea. Seems like a very bad idea. I suppose they were expecting that they could defeat Israel in open battle if the Israelites were crazy enough to come to the defense of Jabesh Gilead. What they didn't count on was that the Spirit of God would come upon Saul, and in a scenario very reminiscent of cutting up the concubine, he cuts up his oxen and sends it to the 12 tribes of Israel and says that they need to come out and defend the Jabesh Gilead. The men do come out, and they do defeat Nahash the Ammonite. They successfully deliver Jabesh Gilead, at which point the people say maybe having Saul as king is not such a bad idea. Of course, we've already seen the warning signs so far. He didn't take out the garrison that he was supposed to, and he was hiding among the baggage, and yet still the people are saying, okay, now we trust that he should be king. Now we trust that we should anoint him. So Samuel says, let's go to Gilgal and there renew the kingdom. This is not the only time or the first time that we've seen Gilgal mentioned. Back in chapter 9, Samuel told Saul that Saul was supposed to go to Gilgal and wait 7 days for Samuel. This seems to be within the midst of that particular scenario. We're really still, it seems, in the first week of Saul's reign. Here we're going to Gilgal, this time to renew the kingdom, this time to anoint Saul as king and recognize him for the third time, the final time. This time's actually going to stick, that he's going to be king over all Israel, not just the people who liked him, as earlier, but now everybody is unanimous in that Saul should be king, which is an odd scenario given the fact that you don't vote for kings, and yet here Saul finally has the support of all the people and will lead accordingly in that support, but first he needs to go to Gilgal and be recognized once more. In 1 Samuel chapter 12, we have Samuel retire. Before he retires as judge, he asks God to make it thunder when it is not the season for thunder. It's not the rainy season. And God answers, which demonstrates to the Israelites that they were better off with Samuel than they were with Saul, because God listens to Samuel. He calls into question their reasoning back in 1 Samuel chapter 8, when they rejected Samuel and God in favor of a king that they could see. They now realize their mistake and they repent. However, it's too late. They already have a king. And of course, this is part of God's plan. Although we wonder if the people had waited on God's timing, it is likely that God would have given them a king anyway, but again would have given them someone in his timing and after his own heart, perhaps giving them David without having Saul. However, the what-if game is difficult to play because God is sovereign over all, and God seems to have orchestrated it this way to teach Israel a lesson, using King Saul as a foil for David, and ultimately as a foil for Christ. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, we read that Saul lived for 1 year and then became king, and that he reigned for 2 years over Israel. This is very odd. We would expect to find out how old Saul was in terms of his age, how long he had lived on earth, and it's probable that he did not become king when he was 1 year old. We would also expect that he reigned for longer than 2 years. There's been great debate over this particular passage. Some scholars have suggested that the 1 year is the 1 year after the birth of David. Others have suggested, including Josephus, that Saul reigned anywhere between 22 to 32 to 42 years. The fact is that we don't know, and debate is continuing to go on in this particular passage. What we do seem to realize, though, in 1 Samuel 13 is that the chronology is not as smooth as we would like it from 1 Samuel chapter 9 up through this chapter, so that the first verse of the chapter is not the only part of this chronology that is a little confusing, because we read that Saul was supposed to wait for Samuel 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. However, that was back in chapter 9 and 10, and a lot has happened since then. Are we supposed to assume that Saul has only made it as king for 7 days before he's rejected as king? Are we supposed to assume that everything that happened with Nahash the Ammonite back in chapter 11 took place in the 7 days between when Saul was initially anointed as king and when he then was appointed at Gilgal? Again, the chronology seems very convoluted here. It seems as though the text is implying that Saul only reigned 7 days, because we've only had the 7 days at Gilgal mentioned one other time. But again, we're probably left with a similar scenario that we saw in Judges, where from time to time the writers will not follow a linear chronology, but will orchestrate events in order to emphasize a point. Again, the whole point here is that God has rejected Saul as being king. Not so much that Saul offered a burnt offering, because we see lots of leaders offering burnt offerings, including kings, such as David. The issue really seems to be more that Saul did not obey. Saul does not listen. He burns the burnt offerings himself rather than waiting for Samuel as appointed. So it is likely that Saul reigned more than 7 days before he was rejected, although again, that is the way that the text could be read literally in a linear chronology, even though I would not recommend that per se. The fact is, we simply don't know how many years that Saul reigned before David became king. There are clues that are offered throughout the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, but it's difficult to come down to an exact conclusion. The Septuagint continues to say 30, Josephus says other people have suggested 40 or 20, and the fact is that a lot of it is just left in theory, conjecture, left in assuming what the timeline is saying, even though the timeline does not explicitly say. In 1 Samuel 14, we see one son of Saul mentioned, the son Jonathan. It's interesting that only one son is mentioned. Apparently, the other two sons are not even in the battle, although when we come to chapter 31, we see that all the sons are in the battle. So, again, some hints maybe at chronology as to when this is taking place. Perhaps the other sons are simply not old enough at this point yet to fight. But for whatever reason, the text is silent both on chronology and for why Jonathan is the only son present. What we do know is that Jonathan has a spiritually good head on his shoulders. He goes to the garrison at Gibeah, probably not the same garrison as Gibeath that was found back in chapter 9 and 10. However, it's possible that this is the same garrison that Saul was supposed to have taken out when he was first anointed as king and did not. Either way, we see the presence of garrisons of Philistines throughout the kingdom of Israel, even during the time of Saul, and the fact that Israel is still continuing to fight against the Philistines all the time of Saul. The people don't really understand what's going on as the Philistines begin to swarm. Eventually, they begin to realize that it's because Jonathan and his armor bearer have attacked a garrison. It's interesting that Jonathan does not necessarily think he's going to have success. He certainly knows that success is possible. He hopes that he has success. However, he says to his armor bearer, "We might die. Perhaps we will go up and attack them. Perhaps God will give us success." In this particular case, God does indeed give success. But Jonathan is simply doing the duty of a soldier and is willing to die in the midst of that duty if necessary. However, we do see Saul's complete lack of spiritual understanding in a way completely different from his son, because David, who eventually is going to become king, forms a relationship with Jonathan, which is unusual since David is in many ways Jonathan's competition for who's going to reign after Saul. But we already see a foreshadowing here in 1 Samuel 14 of the fact that Jonathan understands far more than Saul, because Saul ends up ruining the battle by forming this odd vow in his mind, and then he speaks it out. Nobody's allowed to eat, so the men are tired. Jonathan is really frustrated with his father here, but this sets the stage then for Saul to be rejected as king, not only by God, but even by Jonathan, as Jonathan recognizes that David represents the next king, not Jonathan, and certainly not Saul. Saul will later understand this as Saul tries to kill David and to kill Jonathan, suggesting that Jonathan is a shame even to his mother because of his allegiance with David. So again, we see that Jonathan here is the one that knows what's going on. Saul does not. Jonathan is the one who begins the attack. Saul simply reacts. And again, we're left with that question of if Saul's the one who's supposed to go out and fight Israel's enemies, why is Jonathan the one doing it? Here in 1 Samuel 15, we see an emphasis upon Saul being rejected as king. Rejected ultimately for the second time, although it's explicit here in 1 Samuel 15, it was simply hinted at in 1 Samuel 13, where Saul had sinned by not waiting for Samuel at Gilgal. Here in 1 Samuel 15, Saul will be told that he is rejected as king and that somebody who is better, Tov, just like in 1 Samuel chapter 9, where Saul was Tov and was better, more Tov than anybody else in all of Israel, although in that particular context it meant that Saul was taller than everybody and that Saul was good looking, he was handsome, he was goodly, to use the King James Version. Here in 1 Samuel 15, we find out that it's somebody else who is Tov, better than Saul. In this instance, we know that it's King David, who is a man after God's own heart, who is not just taller than Saul. In fact, he's probably not taller than Saul. Who is not more handsome than Saul. He's ruddy and good looking, but we don't have any indication that he's better looking than Saul. But we do know that he is more spiritual and has a better relationship with God than Saul. He's a man after God's own heart. And in this particular instance, that's what counts. 1 Samuel 15 then will confirm that rejection as Saul will try to grab Samuel's hem and it will rip, and Samuel will say to Saul, "Just as you have torn my cloak, so God has torn the kingdom from you." 1 Samuel 15 is also another emphasis upon glory. We're told that Saul has gone down to build himself a monument, perhaps. The word is yod, to build himself a hand, perhaps to build himself a testimony, or to build himself some sort of monument to congratulate himself over the battle over the Amalekites, even though he hasn't done what he's supposed to do. He will not get the glory ultimately over King Agag. Samuel will get that by hacking King Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. Ironically, again, we're still at Gilgal. Again, the first place where Samuel told Saul that something was wrong and that Saul would not continue as a dynasty. Here it's confirmed even more as Saul has the kingdom torn from him and given to David, again at Gilgal. We also are told that Saul wants not just a monument to his own glory, but even though he's disobeyed God and has been rebuked by Samuel, he still wants Samuel to go with him and give him glory. Verse 30, "I have sinned, yet honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel." In other words, give me glory. Samuel does go along with it and gives Saul the glory somewhat for a victory, although it's a hollow victory because of the fact that Samuel is the one who kills Agag, and because of the fact that Saul has now lost the kingdom and will lose it completely to David after Saul dies. So 1 Samuel 15 is really an emphasis upon that theme of glory and how it is that we get glory. Do we get glory by building ourselves monuments? Do we get glory by taking positions over other kings? Do we get glory by looking good in other people's eyes? And the emphasis is no, we get glory by what we said back in chapter 2, glory by giving God glory and obedience. 1 Samuel 15 is also unusual because this is the passage that says that God repents or that God regrets something. Even though we're told in chapter 15, verse 29, that the glory of Israel, again, there's our emphasis upon the theme of glory, that the glory of Israel does not lie or have regret, or does not repent, as the old King James Version says, for he is not a man that he should have regret. And yet we were told back in verse 10 that God does have regret. So what exactly does this mean? Well, this is very similar to what we saw back in Genesis chapter 6, where we saw God regretting that he had made man. It's not that God has done something out of his will, out of his plan, or that God has somehow made a mistake. Instead, God is saying that he has the human emotion that we might associate with regret, but it's not a true regret, because God is doing exactly what he knew he was doing. God made Saul king in order to teach Israel a lesson, but he knew that Saul was going to sin against him and was going to turn back and not pay attention to God's commandments. So we see here God using human failure in order to teach Israel a lesson, but at the same time, we see God demonstrating the equivalent of an emotion of feeling bad for his people Israel and feeling as though the people of Israel are suffering and that Saul has turned back from following after God to Saul's own detriment. So even though this was all part of the plan of God, even though God knew this was going to happen, even though God orchestrated this to happen, very similar to the original fall of mankind, as well as the flood and the fall of man into sin, both post and pre flood, we see God working all things out for his purpose. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it is a negative, and that God recognizes that it's a negative and that it has a negative impact on his people. One of the biggest questions that we have in ethics, especially when we're dealing with the morality side of ethics, is lying. The old question of if the Germans ask you, are you hiding Jews, do you have to tell them the truth or is it a sin to lie? Well, we have a similar scenario here in 1 Samuel 16, as God tells Samuel, when Samuel complains, I can't go and anoint anybody king because Saul will kill me. Oh, just tell him that you're going to offer the sacrifice. It's an unusual passage because it sounds like God is telling Samuel to lie. I personally take it more as God telling Samuel to tell Saul what Saul needs to know. And withholding extra information is not necessarily a lie, in part because it's really none of Saul's business where Samuel goes. Samuel doesn't answer to Saul. Really, Saul should answer to Samuel, although, as we have seen so far, that doesn't happen either. 1 Samuel 16 is also a confirmation of this whole idea of seeing that we have continued to see all the way from chapter 2. Samuel, as well, has a problem with seeing because he looks on the appearance of Eliab and assumes that this is the Lord's anointed, and yet that is not the case. The Lord tells Samuel, no, God does not see as man sees, because man looks at the appearance, but God looks at the heart. And so we're going to get the man after God's own heart. We're going to get David, who, according to the text, is not so bad in appearance either. But again, we have that confirmation of the fact that it's all about the internal, not the external. Here we see Samuel falling into the same problem that Israel did back in chapter 8 of having someone who was tall and therefore must be king. Here Samuel sees somebody who looks like a king and therefore he must be king. And yet the Lord has to teach even Samuel, no, it doesn't work that way. I'm going to take somebody who's a man after my own heart. The story of David and Goliath is easily one of the most misunderstood and misapplied stories in the Old Testament. Oftentimes, this is spiritualized to say, see, you can face your giants if you just have faith. While that's not untrue per se, if we read other passages in the New Testament, that is not what this passage in particular is saying. This passage in particular is actually saying you cannot defeat your giants. Instead, you need to place your faith in the king to defeat your giants for you. The king, in this particular instance, is Saul. However, we notice that Saul is not fighting the battle the way he's supposed to. Back in 1 Samuel 8, we were told that the purpose of a king, at least as Israel envisioned it, was to go out before the people and fight their battles. And yet, Saul has never wanted to do that. In 1 Samuel 10, he did not attack the garrison. In 1 Samuel 10, he hid among the baggage when it was time to be crowned king. Here, now, we see him not going out and fighting Goliath, but instead sitting in his throne tent, trembling, and all Israel with him. Instead, here comes the young boy David. David comes, a boy who is old enough to go out and fight, but not old enough to be a part of the standing army, because he has to be a certain age in order to be able to be a part of the standing army. He comes and he fights against Goliath. He is the anointed one. Having been anointed in the previous chapter, he is the Messiah. He is the one who comes and slaughters the giant. foreshadowing the slaughter of Satan and sin and death at the hands of Jesus Christ, our great David's greater son, our great Savior and Redeemer, the one in whom we trust. Jonathan recognizes this almost immediately because in chapter 18, verse 4, we read that Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and he gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. Jonathan, in effect, gives to David all of the markers of the crown prince, basically saying to David, David, really, you should be king. Not me. I didn't go out and fight Goliath, and certainly not my father. He didn't go out and fight Goliath. Instead, it is obvious to Jonathan that David is supposed to be the king. And this will be something that Jonathan continues to emphasize to David in the coming years, and something that David continues to emphasize in his own life more and more as he fights Israel's battles for them. Not Saul, but David. David going out and fighting. Again, the call to put the faith in the proper king, the proper Messiah, which in this case is David, foreshadowing again David's greater son, Jesus Christ. There is a question of chronology as it relates to chapter 16 and chapter 17, because at the end of chapter 16, we see David becoming a harp player for Saul, because Saul has a tormenting evil spirit that comes and bothers him, and the playing of the harp helps him to feel better. Then in chapter 17, after David goes out and conquers the Philistine, Saul says, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David says, "Well, I'm the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." There's an emphasis in chapter 16 on the fact that Saul knows exactly who David is. Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight. And then again in chapter 17, him asking, "Whose boy is this? Whose son are you, young man?" The emphasis in chapter 17 could possibly be on who David's father is, asking why David's father has not come to the battle or who are David's brothers. It may not simply be a question of who are you. In verse 56, when the king says, "Inquire whose son the boy is," again, the emphasis seems to be on Jesse. Back in 1 Samuel 16, Samuel seems to know who Jesse is because he writes a letter to Jesse saying, "Let David remain in my service." But again, there might be this question in chapter 17 of, how did the boy who played the harp for me go out and kill a Philistine? Whose son is that? Again, assuming that perhaps Jesse is some mighty warrior that 1 Samuel 16 is not aware of, and Saul questioning, do I need to be concerned about this mighty warrior? Or do I want to make this mighty warrior of Jesse part of my army? So there could be a number of different explanations for why 16 and 17 are phrased the way they are. Another possibility is simply chronology, that there are different stories put in a different order than they actually took place, so that in chapter 17, Saul finds out who David is, but in chapter 16, which takes place later, at least the end of it, Saul is telling Jesse, "I want David to stay with me." So again, number of different ways to put these together. They don't have to prove that the stories are made up or false. David's humility in 1 Samuel 18 has sparked a lot of discussion amongst scholars. What does David mean when he says, "I am a poor man and have no reputation"? We have to remember that the theme of glory or reputation that has taken place so far in 1 Samuel has suggested that you receive your reputation or your glory by glorifying God. And David has certainly done this. He glorified God in 1 Samuel 17 and killed Goliath. However, here David says he has no reputation, which causes us to scratch our heads and to wonder, you've already killed Goliath, you've been said to have killed your tens of thousands. Not saying that he's killed more than Saul. Actually, in Hebrew poetry, line B is parallel with line A, and here tens of thousands is parallel with thousands. Hebrew poetry just tends to take line B a little bit further than line A, so that 4 in line B would actually be parallel to line A and 3, even though in our minds 4 is greater than 3. So here, tens of thousands is not necessarily meant to be greater than thousands, although Saul takes it that way, and although we have seen it that case in 1 Samuel, where David certainly is greater than Saul. And not in keeping with David's declaration that he has no reputation, he's been recognized by Jonathan as the crown prince, and has actually been anointed as the next king by Samuel. So how can David say that he's a poor man and has no reputation? Again, we don't really know. It seems that David has something in mind here. He's willing to go and kill Philistines in order to marry Michal, but he passes up the opportunity to marry Merab. It might be that David thinks that he shouldn't be in the king's family because he's not of that particular tribe. It's possible that David is emphasizing the notion of marrying within your clan. It's possible that David is thinking I'm supposed to kill, if that's his mind, I'm supposed to kill Saul and all of his family so that I can become king. Although we certainly see later on that David understands he's not supposed to touch Saul. So, what exactly does David mean in this? And the answer is we don't really know. Lots of theories, lots of discussions, but we're not really sure. It might simply be a demonstration of David's humility, David's meekness, that even though he has accomplished so much, he still understands that being the anointed, which Saul is of such a higher position than him because he's not currently the king. Saul is the king, and he's deferring to the honor that is associated with that position in Israel, so that we see David's meekness even though he's got plenty to be proud of. For the rest of 1 Samuel, chapters 19 through 31, David is on the run from Saul. Although, as we examine these chapters, there are a lot of oddities to these chapters, especially as they relate to David's faith, and especially as they relate to his relationship with God. Should David have run from Saul in the first place? It's a fascinating question to consider. Obviously, it would appear that David needed to run in order to spare his life, but is that where the lack of faith comes in? That David should have trusted in God to protect him from King Saul rather than running? Or is this more like trusting in God and putting on my seatbelt when I drive in the car? Protecting me might be God's plan, but it might not. Although in David's case, God has explicitly told him he is going to be the next king, and we don't see any example in Scripture of somebody being anointed as king and then not becoming king. So David should have known he's going to be king. Nothing is going to happen to him in the interim. Perhaps David is thinking, well, I could certainly be king without my legs. But maybe David is simply doubting God here, and he's running away from Saul to spare his life, thinking that God may not. The same seems to have been the case even in chapters 21, 27, and 29, when David leaves the promised land, leaves the covenant territory of Israel, and goes to Gath, of all places, which is the home of Goliath. The people in Gath, of course, notice this and say, hey, David's even got Goliath's sword there. And David is the one who has killed his tens of thousands, referencing the Philistines. So David has to lie in order to get out of this situation, pretending to act like a madman. But was David faithless to have gone to Gath in the first place? And then was he faithless in having to lie to get out of it? Or should he have trusted God in both places? Should God have given David the bread at Nob, understanding that the priest is acting in what he thinks is appropriate behavior, and yet the law has said that only priests may eat that bread? So why does David eat of it? We understand from the New Testament and the words of Jesus that this is mercy on the part of the priest, since David and his men are starving. But should David have trusted for God to provide food that he's actually allowed to eat, rather than expecting God to provide food that he typically can't eat? There's also the question of David on the run again after he leaves Gath, again running from King Saul. We see him running again and again and again, but again, is it waiting for God to test God by not running, as though God is somehow going to protect David by some magical force field from the sword of Saul? Or is David supposed to run? This is a question that doesn't fit well with David's faith as we look at David's actions potentially from the perspective of doubt. And then we see David sparing Saul. He quotes this idea that you're not supposed to touch the Lord's anointed, although we haven't really seen that anywhere in the Old Testament. David is consistent in applying this when he kills those who mess with Saul later on, and those who mess with Ishbosheth, even though Ishbosheth is not really the Lord's anointed, but the anointed of northern Israel. Is this just David conveniently using some circumstances to get rid of political rivals? Or does David know of an actual biblical principle? And how does David know that that's the principle? Perhaps the son of Zeruiah is correct, and that David is supposed to kill Saul in one of those instances, and yet he doesn't. Obviously, David does not have a problem killing anybody from the line of Saul because he kills some of his nephews in 2 Samuel, allowing the Gibeonites to slaughter them. Again, these are those who are related to David by marriage, and yet he has no problems handing them over to be killed. So, why does David have a hesitancy here to kill them? Jonathan even understands that that's a possibility because he makes David promise to spare Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, because Jonathan knows that when kings come to power, they kill those who are in their rivalry or those who were part of the previous regime. So, why is David perhaps allowed to do that, but he's not allowed to kill Saul? Is David mistaken here? Or again, does David have a misunderstanding and a misplaced faith? And then in the interaction with Nabal and Abigail, does David overreact? He doesn't seem to be trusting God to provide if he's willing to take an insult and then go and kill the man who made the insult. He's stopped by Abigail from actually doing this, but that was David's intention. In fact, he even takes out an oath against himself that he's going to kill Nabal and every man in that household. That doesn't sound like faith. Again, we're left with these odd circumstances. Why is David's faith potentially not in accord with these actions? Does David not have the faith that we think he has? How is David still called a man after God's own heart when he acts in such a way? The end of 1 Samuel serves as the end of Saul's life. Saul will die in 1 Samuel chapter 31, so this is really the beginning of the end. Saul also realizes that his conflict with David has not ended the way that Saul would like. Jonathan understands that Jonathan is going to be second in command and David will be king. Jonathan, again, back in chapter 18, having given up his position as the crown prince, recognizing David and his authority as the true king of Israel. Here, though, David is still communicating with God because he has an ephod and he has a priest. Saul, on the other hand, does not have an ephod or a priest. God will not answer him, and Samuel died in chapter 25. And so Saul instead is forced to go to a witch, the witch of Endor, and is forced to raise Samuel from the dead in order to talk to someone. Samuel's annoyed at being disturbed, but Samuel also tells Saul that soon Saul and all of his sons will be with Samuel, not saying in heaven, but in the grave. They too will be dead. And this is indeed what's going to happen. Saul and his sons, not all of them, but most of them are going to die, the older ones at least. Ishbosheth, for whatever reason, is of fighting age, but does not go. Also, Saul has several sons by a concubine. Those may have been younger, and so they too do not go and fight in the battle. But the ones that do go and fight in the battle will die alongside Saul. Saul will be struck with arrows. He will then commit suicide by falling on his own sword, until an Amalekite comes along and kills him as requested in 2 Samuel chapter 1. Of course, we don't know if he was really requested or if the Amalekite simply saw an opportunity and took it, an opportunity to claim that he dispatched David's foe. That means that Saul was killed 3 times at the end of 1 Samuel and the beginning of 2 Samuel, once with arrows, although not completely, then falling on his own sword, not completely, and then being killed by the Amalekite, with the question mark on the final one. He may actually have died at the second one, but the Amalekite thought that he could garner favor with David in the midst of this. At the meantime, David is living amongst the Philistines in Ziklag. He's been sacking various towns in southern Israel who are enemies of Israel, enemies of Judah, although he tells the king of the Philistines that actually he's been sacking Judah itself. And David makes sure that he kills everybody so that nobody can get back and say, no, actually, David isn't attacking Judah. He's attacking us, the enemies of Judah. David is very much on Judah's side, working as a double agent here, which again raises all sorts of questions about David's faith and truthfulness in the midst of this. How can David claim to be a man after God's own heart? How can God describe him as a man after God's own heart if he's going to be lying, both to those who are among the Philistines, but also to all who are involved? David, though, is going out to battle with the Philistines against Saul and the Israelites, and we wonder how he's going to get out of this one. But again, David trusts in God, at least in this particular instance, and God does deliver him. The hearts of several of the Philistines are turned back against David, and they question the king and say he needs to go home or else he'll turn on us in battle. And we wonder what would have happened had David gone out to battle and actually fought against
Israel with the Philistines. Even when David is dismissed to go home, he complains and says, I would have gone with you and I would have fought with you. And we're left wondering, is this true? Why are you lying to such an extreme degree? He goes back and finds that his own town has been sacked, which takes him out of the picture during the whole battle between the Philistines and the Israelites. Some secular scholars say it conveniently takes him out of the picture so that he can't be blamed. But even Christian scholars have to admit that God has orchestrated it so that David cannot be blamed for anything that happens in Saul's downfall. David has absolutely nothing to do with it. When Saul is killed, it's possible that the Philistines are going to overrun the capital city, or it's also possible that those who followed after Saul thought that the next person in line, perhaps Ishbosheth or perhaps David, would come and would kill Mephibosheth, who is the son, the firstborn son of the firstborn son. So Mephibosheth is the one who should sit on the throne. Instead, it is Ishbosheth, as we'll see on the next slide. But Mephibosheth and his nurse flee, and in the process, Mephibosheth is dropped, so that at 5 years old he will be lame for the rest of his life. The nurse, again, may have thought that she was saving his life by running, but in fact she ended up damaging him for quite a bit. We see David's mercy to Jonathan and to the covenant, which we'll get to when we get to that point, in his treatment of Mephibosheth, the firstborn son of the line of Saul, who could potentially be a threat to David, as we see later on when David flees from Absalom. So there's a lot going on here at the end. It is a transition period. It's the end of one line of kings and a transition to another line of kings, the beginning of the reign of David, although it's going to be 7 more years before that is accomplished fully. The beginning of 2 Samuel completes the process of Saul's demise. His bodies are recovered by the men of Jabesh Gilead from the walls of the Philistine city. David has them buried in Saul's family tomb, and a lament is sung over him by David. The Amalekite that supposedly killed Saul is executed. We then see David made king in Hebron, where he will now reign for the next 7.5 years. In the northern kingdom, Ishbosheth or Ishbaal is made king of northern Israel. He will serve for 2 years and then will be murdered. This 2 years either takes place at the beginning of David's 7.5 years, so that there is roughly 4.5 years of no king, 5.5 years in the northern kingdom, or it takes place at the end of this 7.5 year period, so that we go 5.5 years without a king, and then a king is appointed. Really, either of those could fit, although I tend to lean more towards the second one, the idea that the Philistines completely overrun northern Israel, kill Saul, kill the royal sons, and perhaps set up garrisons in the northern town. It takes quite a bit of time before the Israelites are strong enough that they can throw off the oppression of the Philistines and begin the retaking and reconquering of their own land. So it might be a time before they finally realize that, hey, it is time for us to set up a king. Abner sets up Ishbosheth, Ishbaal as king, who, as we saw, probably did not go into battle against the Philistines in the first place. Abner did, and Abner seems to think of Ishbosheth or Ishbaal as a puppet king, getting Ishbosheth to do whatever he wants. Abner even sleeps with the concubines of Saul, basically demonstrating Abner's prestige and the fact that Abner is the one who in any ways is the king in Israel, not Ishbosheth. Eventually Ishbosheth will die, but not before there are several battles that take place, which David and Judah win handily. Eventually, after sleeping with the concubines, Ishbosheth will unintentionally insult Abner, who then decides that he's going to take the kingdom of Ishbosheth and give it to David, which he attempts to do. However, before he can do that, he is murdered by Joab. So again, here at the beginning of 2 Samuel, we see some of the court intrigue that is taking place as Ishbosheth and Abner have a conflict, as Abner and Joab have a conflict over the fact that Abner killed Joab's brother in battle, and now Joab has murdered Abner, just as the men of Saul have murdered Ishbosheth or Ishbaal. Raises some questions in our minds as to whether or not we're supposed to understand Joab as being very similar to these men in the north who have killed Ishbosheth or Ishbaal. So we need to keep that in mind as we examine this passage, as well as understanding that there could potentially be a time gap that takes place in the period between Saul and David over all Israel, as only 2 of those 7.5 years are filled by Ishbosheth or Ishbaal. It would imply that the northern kingdom had been overrun by the Philistines, that the Philistines continued to hold control for some time. But now David is coming, and David will come as the conquering warrior, the conquering king, the man of blood, and he will indeed drive the enemies from Israel in his faith in the power of God. We learn in 1 Samuel chapter 31 that King Saul is dead, dying on the slopes of Mount Gilboa alongside his sons, including Jonathan. When the Philistines come to strip the bodies of the dead, they find Saul's body along with his sons and take them to Beth-shan, a town that's not that far from Mount Gilboa. There the bodies are placed on the wall of the town, presumably as a warning to others and as a way to shame the descendants of Saul and the rest of Israel. This is what we've done to your king. The armor is then placed in a temple of Ashtaroth. The men of Jabesh-Gilead, however, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, come across the Jordan River to Beth-shan to reclaim the bodies of Saul and his sons. They then take them back to Jabesh-Gilead, where they bury them underneath a tamarisk tree. We're told that the men of Jabesh-Gilead do this, presumably because that is the town that Saul spared all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 11 from the attack of Nahash the Ammonite, when the men of Jabesh-Gilead had no idea that anybody would come to their defense, because why would they? Jabesh-Gilead is the one town that did not show up with the rest of the Israelites to sack the town of Gibeah and the rest of the Benjaminites at the end of the book of Judges. It was the men of Jabesh-Gilead who were put to death, and their wives were taken and given to the descendants of Benjamin in order to spare that tribe. It's possible that Saul's grandmother or another relative was originally a woman from Jabesh-Gilead. We don't know for sure. What we do know is that Saul is enraged in 1 Samuel chapter 11 and goes to Jabesh-Gilead along with all Israel and rescues them from the Ammonites. Jabesh-Gilead then returns the favor here in 1 Samuel chapter 31 by delivering the bodies of Saul and his sons from the shame of being hung on the walls of Beth-shan. I have a little map here so that you can kind of get a sense of these particular cities and where they are in ancient Israel. The JG all the way to the east or to the right of the Jordan River is Jabesh-Gilead. The top oval is the Sea of Galilee, sometimes called the Sea of Tiberias later on in history. The bottom oval is the Dead Sea, and the line connecting the two is the Jordan River. Just to the left of that line of the Jordan River, you see a capital letter B. That is the town of Beth-shan. That's where the Philistines hung the bodies of Saul and his sons. The G is Mount Gilboa. Just north of the G, we see E, which is Endor, and J, which is Jezreel. We also see an M to the left. That's Megiddo, which doesn't factor in this story, but does show up later in the Bible and kind of gives us a sense of where we are in the country of Israel. We also have, going down the left-hand side of this map, another E and a G. This is Ekron and Gath, the 2 cities of 5 out of all the Philistine cities. To the east of the G, or to the right of the G, is a J. That is the city of Jerusalem. Just outside Jerusalem, you may recall, is the city of Gibeah, not that far, and Gibeon, another town. South of the J, south of Jerusalem, is the H. This is Hebron. This is the town that David will reign in for almost 7 years. To the left, to the west of the H is a Z for Ziklag. This is the town that is given to David in Philistine territory. And then all the way at the bottom is a B, which is Beersheba. This is the southernmost town in Israel and marks the border of Israel before you start getting into Egypt and Arab territory. So again, just an idea of our geography here in Israel. Of course, it does raise some questions because it suggests then that the Philistines went from the G on the far left, Gath on the western coast, north to Ekron, and then proceeded north as though they were going to Megiddo. They stop at a town called Ashkelon, which we don't know where Ashkelon is exactly, but presumably it's somewhere between the E and the M. They then turn east or to the right and head over towards the J, E, G, and B. We're kind of confused though. If they were trying to get to Saul in Gibeah, just north of the J, which is Jerusalem, although not yet in Israelite territory, Gibeah is where Saul is, so why not just go east across the country of Israel and take on Saul in Gibeah? Well, there is a reason for that, and it has to do with Israel's geography. The answer has to do with the topography of Israel. I've included here on the map another oval. This oval is representing the mountains of Israel. There are several different mountain chains or groups of hills. For instance, we've talked quite a bit about the hill country of Ephraim in the book of Judges in the beginning of 1 Samuel. This particular chain of mountains is sometimes called the Western Mountains, as it is in the topography map to the right, or the Central Highlands, among other names. The red dot here on the eastern side of these mountains is the city of Jerusalem. I've also added the city of Gath, which is the G on the western side of the oval, to the map on the right, the red dot that is due west of Jerusalem. As you can see, you could go from Gath, the red dot, straight east to Jerusalem. However, you would have to cross the mountains. We certainly know that this is possible, because in between Gath and Jerusalem is the town of Beth Shemesh, which is the town where the Philistines send the Ark of the Covenant in 1 Samuel chapter 6, loading it on a cart, attaching 2 cows, and having those cows take it back to Israel. So it's possible. However, there's a big difference between a cart pulled by 2 cows and an entire army. Often what would happen is that the armies would march north along the western side of the mountains, and then as they reached the northern part of the mountains, turn to the east, headed over towards Jezreel and towards Mount Gilboa. Right on the tip of this particular oval, although it's not marked on my oval, but it is marked on the map to the right, is the city of Shechem, which literally means shoulder. This is the shoulder of these particular mountains on the far end, the far northern end of this chain of mountains. So as the men would leave Gath and go to Ekron, they would pass north, presumably would end up in Ashkelon, although we're not particularly sure where Ashkelon was, but it's north of Ekron. They would then turn to the east and go through a mountain pass into the valley of Jezreel. And this is where the battle would have taken place, in the valley of Jezreel on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. So geography plays a huge part in the history of Israel, requiring various peoples to go in particular directions in order to attack Israel. As I mentioned, the men of Jabesh Gilead, hearing that Saul is dead in Gilboa and that his body is on the walls of Bethshan, which is a great insult to Saul and his sons, the men of Jabesh Gilead progress west across the Jordan River, go to Bethshan, take the bodies from Bethshan, rescue them, and bury them. This is a great act on behalf of the men of Jabesh Gilead, because we're told that all of the towns along the Jordan River, even on the side of the Jordan River that Jabesh Gilead is located on, run. They basically fear the Philistines are going to invade all of Israel, and they abandon their towns. The men of Jabesh Gilead, though, very similar to commercials I'm sure you've seen for the U.S. Marines, do not run away from danger, but run directly towards it. The Philistines have apparently taken over some of these towns here in the valley of Jezreel and along the Jordan River, but the men of Jabesh Gilead are undaunted. They go, they take the bodies, and they escape with them and bury them. We're told that the armor is in a temple of Ashtaroth, which is presumably also in Bethshan, which is part of the problem in Israel, that they are still syncretistic. They have a temple of Ashtaroth, which the Philistines apparently recognize. We talked about this several weeks ago, that even though the Philistines worship Dagon, they have simply added Dagon into the rest of their pantheon of gods. Dagon is not the only Philistine god. In fact, Dagon is not even technically a Philistine god. It's been found in other areas of Mesopotamia and was probably transported to the region of the Philistines by the Philistines themselves. Ashtaroth is another popular goddess that is worshipped, and here we see a temple in Israel to this particular goddess. The men of Jabesh Gilead, though, go and rescue the body, and probably the armor as well, from the walls of the city and the temple, and restore them to a proper burial, honoring the bodies of Saul and his sons. In 2 Samuel chapter 1, we have an expectation of how the book is going to begin. We assume that David is going to be installed as king of Israel. After all, this is what he was anointed for back in 1 Samuel chapter 16, what Samuel promised from God. Instead, however, in 2 Samuel chapter 1, we see the love that David had for Jonathan and Saul. And not just love for Jonathan and Saul, but a respect for Saul's office as the anointed one of God. We see an Amalekite messenger come and tell David in Ziklag that Saul has been killed. In fact, the Amalekite claims that he killed Saul. This is the third time that we've seen Saul close to death. He was shot with arrows and presumably was going to die. So instead, he asked his armor bearer to kill him so that it would not be said that the Philistines had killed him, which implies that the wound that he had received from the Philistines was a mortal wound and he was going to die. The armor bearer refuses, so Saul falls on his own sword. And now here we have the Amalekite saying that when he found Saul, Saul was still leaning on his spear. Again, we have a mention of Saul's spear, and not usually in a good way. Saul's spear is usually doing nothing. And yet here he is with his spear on the verge of death, and the Amalekite has to kill him. Presumably the Amalekite is telling the truth, which would make the third time Saul has died, perhaps a companion to the 3 times that Saul becomes king, back in chapters 10 and 11. But here we have him die again. It is possible, however, that the Amalekite has completely made up the story, that Saul was already dead, and that the Amalekite thought that somehow he would gain a reward from David for being the one who actually put Saul out of his misery, for killing David's rival. David, however, instead flips it and says, well, you said you killed him, so therefore you deserve to be executed. And the Amalekite is struck down. Rather than praise, David gives the Amalekite the justice that is deserved. He struck the Lord's anointed. We then see a lament, not just for Jonathan, but a lament for Saul. Again, not a fake lament. After all, this is Israel's psalmist who is singing here. He composes a lament for Saul and Jonathan. And then we see him reward the men who went and captured the bodies at Beth-shan, the men of Jabesh-Gilead, rewarding them and thanking them for what it is that they have done for Saul. So we see David acting very noble here, very kingly, but we also see him not killing off the descendants of Saul and Jonathan completely, instead showing a love for the house of Jonathan and Saul, mourning for them, crying for them, and executing anyone who dared to touch them. It's a completely unexpected turn of events, because again, what we really anticipated seeing was David become king, but we really have to wait until chapter 2 before that will happen. In chapter 2, David is finally installed as king, however, only king of Hebron. All of Israel instead follows after the descendant of Saul, Ishbosheth, who is presumably one of the only sons that is left. We do find out later that the concubine of Saul had several sons. Those sons will be put to death at the end of 2 Samuel. But for now, Ishbosheth takes over. We also hear that Ishbosheth was 40 years old, which raises the question, why is it that Ishbosheth did not go to battle with the rest of his brothers and his father? We don't really know. Perhaps the text is suggesting that he's weak. We already had one weak king, but at least Saul went out to battle. Ishbosheth doesn't even go to battle. What also is surprising then is that Abner takes that son, the one who did not go to battle, and makes him king. This shows Abner's ability to be the kingmaker, and over time we begin to realize that Abner has ulterior motives in this. We see as Abner and Ishbosheth continue to have some conflict, as Abner goes and sleeps with Ishbosheth's concubines. Sleeping with the royal concubines was only done by the king, and in essence was the person who was sleeping with them saying, I'm king. So Abner here is declaring, by sleeping with these concubines, that he, not Ishbosheth, is the true power in northern Israel. He is the true king. And Ishbosheth simply stays out of his way because Ishbosheth is afraid of Abner. Abner then, because he's mad at Ishbosheth, decides that he's going to hand over the northern kingdom to David, and that David can become king. This is the outcome of that conflict between Abner and Ishbosheth. However, that creates a problem between Abner and Joab, because in the 2 years that Abner was actually serving Ishbosheth, they had had a battle, and Abner had killed Joab's brother. Joab, obviously, is very upset about that, so as Abner comes to talk to David about handing over the kingdom to him, Joab takes Abner apart silently and kills him, murders him in cold blood. Not in battle, but murders him in cold blood because Abner had killed Joab's brother in battle. So we see a rivalry that began with Abner and Ishbosheth that results in a rivalry between Abner and Joab and eventually causes Abner to be murdered, which then creates a rivalry between David and Joab, one that will continue in an uncomfortable way through the rest of 2 Samuel and all the way into 1 Kings, as Joab continues to murder anybody who gets in his way and is a rival to be the head of the armies of Israel. Joab is keeping his position as David's right-hand man, and curiously, David is allowing him to remain as his right-hand man, even though he has murdered Abner. After 2 years, Ishbosheth himself is murdered, and David is appointed as the king of all Israel. However, as I've mentioned before, David reigned in Hebron for 7 years. Ishbosheth is only king for 2 years. Where are the other 5 years? The reality is we don't know. Was Ishbosheth made the king of northern Israel at the first part of the 7 years that David is in Hebron, or at the end? I tend to think at the end, because Israel is absolutely terrified of the Philistines in the first couple years that David is reigning in Hebron. The Philistines have conquered Israel on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. They've obviously taken the town of Beth-shan and several of the other towns along the Jordan River, so that the north is full of Philistines. It's quite possible that it takes time for the Philistines to be driven out so that Ishbosheth can be set up as king, which makes me think that it's the end of the 7 years that Ishbosheth reigns for 2 years. Either way, by the end of the 7-year period, Abner and Ishbosheth are both dead, Ishbosheth being murdered by some of Saul's men, Abner being murdered by Joab. David and Joab take over all of Israel and begin to make preparations for solidifying the reign of David over the entire country. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, we read that David, at 30 years old, becomes the king of Israel in Hebron, serving over Judah as king, and then 7 years later, at the age of 36 or 37, becomes the king of all Israel. We also know that David, at the most, is 17 years old when he kills Goliath. David has 3 brothers older than him who are not qualified to fight in the battle because they're not 20 years old. So we know that David and his 3 brothers are all under 20, which means the most David could possibly be is 17. He's probably significantly younger, which suggests then that from the time David killed Goliath until the time that he actually becomes king is a minimum of 13 years. Again, we don't know where in that 13-year period that King Saul went crazy and started trying to kill David, but we do know that Saul appoints David to be over his armies in 1 Samuel chapter 18 and 19, which suggests that David is over 20 when that takes place, otherwise he couldn't even be in the army. This would also suggest then that there is a passage of time from the time that David kills Goliath until the time that he begins to fight the enemies of Israel under King Saul. Either way, though, we know that somewhere around 15 years passes from the time that David kills Goliath until he becomes king. Not a terribly long time to wait, especially since he's going to reign as king for 40 years, but I'm sure to David it felt like a long time. David finally becomes king. He's established as king. He then goes and takes the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites after they mock him and say he won't be able to get in. He does indeed get in. He also takes on King Hiram of Tyre as an ally, which shows how powerful the house of David has become, that Hiram is somewhat afraid of him and makes a treaty with him. We also see David handily defeat the Philistines. All of these serve to solidify his rise as king over all Israel, reigning in a new palace, in a new capital in Jerusalem. We also appear to see in 2 Samuel chapter 6 the rise of David as priest. However, we need to keep in mind that David is not being a priest here. He's actually acting as a king was supposed to act. If you remember back in Exodus chapter 19, God told the people of Israel through Moses that they were a kingdom of priests. It would imply then that they would have a priestly king, which we certainly see codified later on, especially in the prophecies of Zechariah, as the priest is crowned and called the branch, using a Davidic term for the Messiah. And we see, obviously, Jesus being priest and king, alongside being prophet. But David here also functions as a prophet and a king, and it appears as a priest, although he's simply doing his job as the king. One of the duties of the king is to preserve the worship of God and to make sure that the priests are doing their job. So David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Since this is going to be the place that serves as his capital, it makes sense to have God's throne there as well as David's throne. Some people have suggested that David is actually just moving to solidify the people's allegiance to him in Jerusalem, which is certainly possible. It doesn't mean that because he's worshiping God that he's not also being politically advantageous, but at the same time, we do see his love for God is what motivates him to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and setting it up in a tent. We might even call this the Tabernacle of David, since it appears that there is still something located at Gibeon, because that is where Solomon will go after he is made king. He will go to Gibeon, where God will meet with him and give him wisdom. David here attempts to bring the ark into Jerusalem, but he doesn't do it the right way. In fact, David completely ignores the law of God in the transport of the Ark of the Covenant, which ends up killing Uzzah along the way when he touches the Ark of the Covenant. David originally sends the Ark of the Covenant to the house of Obed-Edom, but when the house of Obed-Edom is blessed, David wants that for himself, naturally, so he brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, this time doing it correctly, according to the law of God. David may make a lot of mistakes, but he seems to learn from them as he does here. He sees the law of God, he sees the requirements of how you transport the ark, he transports it appropriately and brings it into Jerusalem. Along the way, he is dancing in a linen ephod. Some people have said, oh, he's dancing in his underwear, which on the one hand may seem correct, except that an ephod is what priests wear. And so the writer of Samuel is not including this to show that David has stripped himself, as Michael will later say, but instead that he is acting priestly by dancing in the ephod before the Lord, and, according to the text, offering sacrifices. He is serving as a priestly figure here. Again, this was something that Saul could have done all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 13 if Samuel had not said, wait for me 7 days. And that's really the issue. Not to mention the fact that Saul seemed to view the offering of sacrifices to God the same as divination, just one more superstitious thing that you needed to do before going into battle. Whereas here we see David's sincerity as he's worshiping God as the Ark of the Covenant is brought into Jerusalem. He's rejoicing. And then when Michal despises him and says, you made a fool of yourself, David reminds her, it doesn't really matter what I appear like, I'm worshiping God. He basically curses Michal and she no longer has children, which again serves to end the line of Saul. Saul's descendants are getting smaller and smaller and smaller in number because they keep doing stupid things, such as insulting David. So here, David, in effect, curses Michal so that she will not bear a descendant, which is convenient because that descendant can't then claim to have a right to the throne because he's descended from both David and Saul. This kind of clears up a potential messy situation, but at the same time highlights theologically what David's emphasis really is. David is worshiping God first and foremost. The covenant with David is one of the most important covenants of the Old Testament. Not that any of them are unimportant, but this covenant is one of the last covenants outside of the new covenant mentioned in Jeremiah 31. As David says to God, God, I want to build you a house. And God instead responds to David, no, I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to have your descendants be, in effect, my children, and they will sit on my throne forever. In some sense, this is an unconditional covenant. David is going to sin, but it doesn't break the covenant. They'll go into exile as a people, but it doesn't break the covenant. And yet it's not truly unconditional because there are conditions in the form of curses. If the person, this being the Davidic king, does not follow after God, God, he says, will punish him. Not take away the covenant, not take away the house of David, not utterly destroy them, but he will punish them with the floggings of men. Other kings will come along from other nations that will punish Israel for the sin of the Davidic king. And we do see this repeatedly in Israelite history, even in the stories of Solomon, that Solomon is punished by the attack of other kings because of the fact that he has left God and gone to worship other gods. Not very wise per se, but it is what Solomon ends up doing. So on the one hand, this is a grant more than a treaty or a covenant, and yet it is a covenant in the sense that there are expectations of what it is that David is supposed to do and what his descendants are supposed to do. This covenant also seems to form the foundation for Psalm 2, where God says, I have installed my anointed one on my holy hill. And he refers to the Davidic king in Psalm 2 as his son. Now, we certainly know from the New Testament that Jesus is not just God's son because he's the Messiah, because he's the king. He really is God's son. However, because of the understanding of Jewish religion, the Israelites, even at the time of Jesus, would have understood Jesus not as actually claiming divinity, but as claiming the fact that he was the anointed one. There are a couple places, however, where Jesus takes that further than the Israelites are comfortable with and actually claims to be divine, such as calling himself the I Am. Thus, we see Jesus is re-correcting or re-establishing what it really means in Israel that he is the Son of God. He's Davidic, he is from the Davidic line, so he is the adopted son as the one who will sit on the throne of David, but Jesus really is God's son. He's both the Messianic Son of God from Psalm 2, but also the actual Son of God. It's very ironic, which is part of why the Israelites miss it at the time of Christ. But this is the foundation of that here, as God promises to David that David will always have a son to sit on the throne, and that son will actually be God's son, which we begin to see in Solomon as he is called Jedediah, God's beloved, because that is God's son, again portrayed in Psalm 2. Following the covenant with David made by God in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we see David respond in faith in the next few chapters. Immediately in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, David prays a prayer of thanksgiving to God for the incredible blessing. David is just amazed and blown away by what it is that God is doing for him. Then in chapters 8 and 9, we see David respond in action. Responding first militarily in action, David believes that God is with him because that's what God has promised. David doesn't believe he can be defeated, and he goes out and he defeats the nations handily. We also see, though, David extending grace to Mephibosheth. It's possible that Mephibosheth's name is Mephibaal, since Bosheth has to do with shame. It's possible that the Israelite writer of 1 Samuel changed Mephibaal's name to Mephibosheth so as to shame him, literally. It's also possible that Mephibaal received the nickname Mephibosheth after the death of Saul. We know that Mephibosheth was 5 years old when Saul died. It was 7 years from the time that Saul died until the time that David became king of all Israel. So that would suggest that Mephibosheth is at least 12 years old, the 5 plus the 7. However, we find out that Mephibosheth has a son named Micah. And since I don't think that many 12-year-olds were having children in Israel, it's presumable that Mephibosheth is quite older, which also suggests that David did not immediately make a covenant with Mephibosheth when David became king. Instead, this really seems to be a response later in David's life, as David is making a covenant with God, or more specifically, God is making a covenant with David. David, you don't have to worry about your line being broken by the descendants of Saul, who come back and try to establish Saul's kingdom. Instead, recognize that I am with you and your descendants, and you, David, will always have somebody sitting on the throne. David is then freed to go and extend grace to Mephibosheth, because he doesn't view Mephibosheth as a threat. So in that sense, it may be much later in David's life and much later in the time that he is waging war against other nations before he actually extends his grace to Mephibosheth. His kingdom, David's kingdom, has been firmly established before he goes and allows what could be a potential rival to come into his household. We continue to see this covenant play out with Mephibosheth, and we wonder, is it an unconditional covenant? On the one hand, no, it's not unconditional, because when David flees Israel, fleeing from Absalom, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, says that Mephibosheth thinks that God is going to give the kingdom back to the descendants of Saul. We find out later that this is probably a lie, and yet when David finds out that it's a lie, he restores everything that he took from Mephibosheth back to Mephibosheth. So in that sense, it's conditional. You have to be loyal to David in order to retain what is yours. But on the other hand, David is quick to forgive and quick to divide things up between Ziba and Mephibosheth, rather than worry about who said what and what said who, instead just simply saying split it, at which point Mephibosheth says, yeah, that's fine, I'm just glad, David, that you are safe. So we see a relationship that develops between David and Mephibosheth over time, as Mephibosheth realizes David is not going to kill me. Instead, David is going to extend a covenant faithfulness because of the covenant that he made with Jonathan. So David here has experienced a covenant, an unconditional covenant or unconditional covenant with God, and then turns around and extends that same grace and favor towards somebody else who doesn't deserve it, somebody else who was unlikely, the house of Mephibosheth, part of the house of Jonathan. So we see the application of David's faith in the covenant of God here in his relationship with Mephibosheth, as again, it is completely out of the ordinary for you to have the son of your rival, your enemy even, who had a rival kingdom, to come and to hang out at your table. Not as a prisoner. Some people have suggested David was doing this so he could keep an eye on Mephibosheth, but it really seems that he's extending grace to Mephibosheth as he himself has experienced grace. Unfortunately, the far more famous parts of the life of David are the fall of the kingdom of David. In 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, we have the story of David and Bathsheba. Very sad story, as David pretty much throws away everything. He's accused by Nathan of taking, and that really seems to be the problem here. Not just adultery, but taking. God had given David all of his other wives, but this one David has gone and taken it for someone else. He took it from Uriah, one of his 30 mighty men whom he knew quite well. He takes Bathsheba, so that as he's asking the question, whose wife is that, or what woman is that over on the rooftop, he may be saying it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, because he knows who it is. It's also possible, though, that we see an emphasis of the seeing or the inability to see, which we have had in 1 Samuel, that David actually can't see and doesn't know who that is, at which point the person that he asks, whose woman is that, basically says to David, David, you're an idiot. You know who that is. That's Bathsheba. So David can't see, and even when he does see and find out who she is, he doesn't see what he's going to do to himself and to his kingdom when he sins, which he does. He takes her, he murders Uriah, has an affair with Bathsheba. Her son will die, the first child that is born to David and Bathsheba, but the second one will be Solomon. And God will use that unusual, sinful even, union between David and Bathsheba to produce a very godly king, at least in the first part of his life, as he becomes the descendant and the successor to the throne of David. As a result, though, of David's sin, there are a number of consequences. We have Amnon, who rapes his sister Tamar in the next chapter, in 2 Samuel chapter 13. Absalom, who is the full brother of Tamar and not a half-brother like Amnon, goes and kills Amnon. We then have Absalom, who flees and then eventually comes back, but then eventually sets up his own rebellion against his father. Perhaps because he's upset that his father did not do justice for Tamar when Amnon raped her. Instead, David kind of ignores it. Perhaps Absalom just wants power. But for whatever reason, he goes and he sets up his own rival kingdom. It would appear to some degree that Amnon would have been king either way, since he was the next oldest in line after Amnon. Adonijah would have been a rival who will also set up a rival kingdom after David dies, but at least for now, Absalom is impatient and isn't willing to wait, and so he sets himself up as a ruler and has some success for a time, but eventually it will end in Absalom's death. After Absalom, we have Sheba, who also forms a rebellion in 2 Samuel chapter 20, and who takes the descendants of Saul and starts his own rebellion, but he too will be killed and will come to an end, ending the rebellions, or at least the rebellions that are mentioned in Israel, all because of the fact that David sinned with Bathsheba. As Nathan said, the sword will never depart from your house because of what you did to Uriah the Hittite. And we certainly see this. David continues to suffer the consequences. Even though his sin is forgiven, he suffers the consequences for the rest of his life. At the end of 2 Samuel, the life of David is beginning to wrap up. We're preparing for the succession, although we don't know who that's going to be at this point. We know from 1 Kings it's Solomon, but there's no indication of that here in 2 Samuel. We're beginning to tie a nice, neat bow on the lifetime of David. Here in 2 Samuel chapter 21, he eliminates the last threats of the line of Saul. executing them because of something that Saul did during his reign, which is odd because we're told that in the law that the sons are not supposed to be put to death for the sins of the father. It's a very unusual passage, one of the more difficult passages of the Old Testament. Why does David execute a group of people who are technically his nephews, since he's married to their aunt, Michal, and yet he allows them to be executed, to be killed, and for the Gibeonites to do it? And the Gibeonites request such an odd request, actually thinking that David was going to give them sons of Saul to kill in revenge, and yet that's what Saul does. Saul begins to take vengeance on the Gibeonites, so the Gibeonites take vengeance on Saul's family, and David allows it, in fact, enables it. Again, a very unusual story in an unusual situation, but it serves to get rid of any claimants who could possibly be left from the line of Saul, who would want to take the throne after David dies. In 2 Samuel 21 through 22, we read of the end of battles. David's not allowed to go out and fight with the men anymore. He's just simply too old. He cannot do it, and they're afraid that he's going to be killed. In 2 Samuel chapter 23, David responds by giving a great psalm, a great song, again, that serves as the bookend to 2 Samuel, really mirroring the song of Hannah back in 1 Samuel, and even mirroring some of the same themes. He's wrapping up his lifetime by giving his last will and testament, as it were, his last words, although we see him speaking in 1 Kings, but at least here in Samuel, wrapping up. And then we get to 2 Samuel chapter 24, which is the end of, well, we don't really know what it's the end of. It is probably one of the more bizarre endings of any book in the Old Testament. It's very similar to the book of Judges and how crazy the ending of the book of Judges is, where we end again with a cultic festival and the women in Shiloh being kidnapped. Fortunately, there's no widow being kidnapped here in Jerusalem. Instead, we have thousands upon thousands of people being killed by the angel of death because of what David has done. David numbers the people, demonstrating a pride, a self-confidence that he is able to defend Israel, that he, with his armies, is able to set up an empire, and God judges him accordingly. Even though Joab, of all people, tries to warn him, David still acts presumptuously in his pride. He doesn't pay the temple tax that he's supposed to for each man. He numbers them, which he's not supposed to do, and God judges him, allows David graciously to pick the type of punishment, but David is still responsible for the deaths of many of his people. Eventually, the plague is going to be ended when David goes to the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. There David will buy from Araunah the threshing floor, which will become the site of the future temple. It's an odd story, and while there's a theological purpose, David having pride and dependence in his own power, and yet here buying the plot of land that will be the placement of the temple, which will be a constant reminder that you have no spiritual power and that you deserve to die. Irony there, and yet at the same time, it's a very odd way to end a book. Just leaves us hanging. We've bought a threshing floor, and now we're done. It doesn't really set the stage for 1 Kings, other than the fact that the temple is going to be built in 1 Kings. But again, a very unusual way to end a book. So it's the end of the book, it's the end of the chapter, it's the end of the story, although we're not really sure why. It's almost as though the writer of 1 Samuel knows that 1 Kings is coming, which again is very unusual because 1 Kings is written so much later than 1 Samuel. So this seems to have been predisposed by God for the writer of 2 Samuel to do this, to leave it kind of hanging, somewhat again in the spirit of Judges, but to leave the book hanging, knowing that something else is going to be coming down the line to fulfill that covenant with David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, but also to fulfill the covenant of God with Israel in establishing a temple. I mentioned in our last lecture that 2 Samuel chapter 24 is a very unusual way to end the story of David. We tie up the story of David by putting a nice neat bow on it, that bow being a catastrophic failure, as David has a catastrophic sin that costs the lives of 70,000 men from Dan to Beersheba. It's convenient, at least in terms of the story goes, because David will go and purchase the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, which according to the tradition that the chronicler will lay out is actually the site where Abraham was going to offer Isaac on the mountains of Moriah, and this is also the spot where Solomon would build the temple. So it is a nice, neat transition from 2 Samuel to 1 Kings. Although keep in mind that really the story from 1 Samuel through 2 Kings is really part of one story and was probably originally one book. However, there are some clues that if we were to divide it, we would divide it where we have divided it. Because 2 Samuel ends with this nice song and poem by David, just as 1 Samuel opened with a nice poem by Hannah. So we have this nice bookend that tells us this is deliberate. We also have a nice chiasm here, that term coming from A and then B as the first two thoughts, and then B and then A, so a reverse. If we were to lay these out on a piece of paper, we would have A, and then under A we would put B, and then in the next column we would have B at the top and A at the bottom. So AB, BA. When you then connect the B's with a line and connect the A's with a line, you end up with an X, which looks like the Greek letter chi, hence the term chiasm or chiasm, basically a repetition in reverse order. In 2 Samuel 21, we have a problem. There is an outbreak or some evidence of God's anger against Israel that we have to find out what has been done and how can we fix it. David finds out it's by Saul's sin, and he fixes it by allowing the 7 sons of Saul to be executed. Although several scholars have pointed out that the plague doesn't really end until David collects all the bones of the 7 sons and the bones of Saul and Jonathan and reburies them in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father. Only then does the plague actually stop. We also have an indication that the Rizpah, the concubine of Saul, has been watching over the bones this entire time. We get the impression that the execution took place in spring and that she has watched them through the entire summer and that then they are reburied in fall. So it's been a substantial amount of time that has taken place here. And then once David goes and properly disposes and gives a proper burial to all of those bones, then God sees fit to allow the plague to stop. We have the same plague take place in 2 Samuel 24. Again, God is angry. We don't know why. But he incites David, who then goes and numbers the people, which then causes a plague, which then once again has to be atoned for. This time it is atoned by sacrifices on what will become the Temple Mount. So our bookends here are 2 Samuel 21 and 2 Samuel 24. In the middle, we have mighty men, as we see at 2 Samuel 21, the occurrence of several mighty men and their mighty deeds, followed by the words of David. We then transition to 2 Samuel 23 and the last words of David, and again an account of mighty men, so going in the reverse order of the previous chapters, and then again wrapped up by that plague that takes place in 2 Samuel 24. So it's clear that 2 Samuel 21 through 2 Samuel 24 really do form a unit of several chapters here at the end of 2 Samuel. These are not just random ideas that are put on, and these are not just a random conclusion to a book, but a well thought out bookend to the book. We then transition into the first several chapters of 1 Kings with David handing over the kingship to Solomon and rejoicing in the fact that he actually gets to see Solomon become king while he's still alive. So as we've ended 2 Samuel, we haven't ended with David dead. We actually wait till 1 Kings chapter 2 for that to take place. So in many ways, the first 2 chapters of the book of Kings could almost be considered the last 2 chapters of 2 Samuel, except that they're not because we have divided the books where we've divided them, based on that bookend and based on the chiasm that takes place in 21 through 24. Keeping in mind that our chapter divisions and even our book divisions based on scrolls are not inspired, although they become tradition and there is a reason that we have done it, but we do need to understand that the story of David really continues in those first couple chapters of Kings as a transition into Solomon. We don't end the story of David in 2 Samuel 24, and in some ways we don't really end the book because it continues into 1 Kings, but we do end the book, at least for our purposes in our English Bibles, tying it up with a nice neat bow, but that bow is really a transition to the next book. as eventually this is where the temple will be built by Solomon, who we're about to meet. The first chapter of 1 Kings is an unusual chapter. First, we have King David, who is old and can't get warm, and so he has to have a concubine who snuggles with him in order to keep him warm. The text is very careful to say that David does not actually know her, does not have sexual relations with her, although in some ways this is probably another indication of how old he is, the fact that he may not be able to have sexual relations with her if he wanted to. Again, showing David's weakness here. The chapter is also unusual because Adonijah goes and sets himself up as king, which is odd because, awkwardly, David is not dead yet. Adonijah is presumptively having himself crowned as king and preemptively having himself crowned as king. His reaction when he hears that Solomon has been crowned king suggests that Adonijah knew that Solomon was supposed to be king. And the fact that Adonijah goes and asks Solomon for mercy while Adonijah is clinging to the horns of the altar also suggests that Adonijah knew that he was not supposed to be the next king and that Solomon would be the next king. This is important to realize because Nathan and Bathsheba go to David while he's laying in bed trying to stay warm, a very pathetic scene, and point out the fact that Adonijah has made himself king, and yet ask David, didn't you say Solomon was supposed to be king? We have no indication of a story previously in either 1st or 2nd Samuel of David telling us that Solomon was going to be king. We do, however, have an indication in 2nd Samuel that Solomon is called Jedediah by the Lord himself, Jedediah meaning beloved of the Lord. So it would appear that the Lord himself has selected Solomon as the next king, and that this is not just political intrigue on the part of Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, nor is it simply the will of David. This is the will of God. Once Adonijah hears what has happened, he and all of his co-conspirators flee. Joab is one of those co-conspirators, and in 1 Kings chapter 2, Solomon will actually execute Joab, according to the words of David. David warns Solomon not to let Joab's head go down to the grave in peace, and Solomon takes care of this by having him executed even while he's holding on to the horns of the altar. It's interesting that David himself does not take care of this, and we're not really told why. It's possible that David and Joab were close enough in blood relations because of the fact that it is David's sister's sons that are the sons of Zeruiah. That's one possibility. Others have suggested that it's simply a tradition that you don't execute family members. Again, the oddity of this is that Solomon is instructed to execute them. A third possibility is that David needs Joab. Joab is the leader of his armies, and David is afraid that if he really tries to replace Joab will rebel against him, especially because every time that David replaces Joab simply kills the replacement. Maybe David is afraid of Joab the way that Ishbosheth was afraid of Abner. The text never explicitly states it, but it does imply that that is indeed the case. Solomon's justice also has to do with the execution of Shimei, the man who insulted David. We are told that Solomon is wise and that Solomon tells Shimei that he's not allowed to leave Jerusalem. He tells him that he's not allowed to leave Jerusalem crossing a particular river. However, when Shimei does leave Jerusalem, he doesn't cross that river. But he does leave Jerusalem, and Solomon sees this as an opportunity to execute him, which he does. Solomon also removes Abiathar as priest, which fulfills the promise all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 3, where God told Eli that his sons would no longer be priests. Once Eli is removed, the house of Abiathar is no longer priests, and instead the house of Zadok begins as priests, although it appears that the two of them had functioned for a while as co-priests. Now it is just Zadok who will be priest. 1 Kings 2 is really focused on justice being meted out by Solomon as he follows the instructions of David. But in 1 Kings 3, we realize that Solomon has wisdom of his own and that he's able to think on his own because Solomon asked for wisdom from God. He goes to the high place at Gibeon. The Ark of the Covenant is in Jerusalem, of course, but the rest of the tabernacle seems to be in Gibeon. Solomon goes there, has a vision where God asks him what he wants, and he says he would like wisdom. And by 1 Kings chapter 4, we begin to see that wisdom demonstrated, and Solomon's kingdom is established as he begins to wisely answer the problems of the people, wisely lead his kingdom. He has solidified his kingdom. Eventually, he will even execute Adonijah for Adonijah wanting to take Abishag, the concubine of David that was keeping David warm. Again, we remember back to the idea of concubines with Ishbosheth and Abner, and even with Absalom and David, the fact that taking a king's concubines meant that you were taking the kingship. And Solomon points this out to Adonijah before Adonijah is executed. So in the end, 1 Kings 1 through 4 really establish Solomon's reign. They transition from David to Solomon. David dies. Solomon asks for wisdom. Solomon executes anybody who is a political rival under David and establishes his reign and prepares to build the temple. 1 Kings 5 through 9 tell the story of the building of the Temple of Solomon, a process that takes 7 years, which is very common for stories of the building of temples in the ancient Near East. We have a similar account in the Gudea cylinders, which also takes 7 years. We also have 7 being the number of days that it takes to build a world, both in the creation story that we read in Genesis 1 and 2, and in the epic of the Enuma Elish, where it takes 7 tablets to build the world. 7 is very important here. There's also another link in 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 40, where we read that Hiram rested from the works that he had done, which sounds very similar to God resting from his works of creation. Creation and the temple are directly linked. We talk about this more in the Pentateuch in the book of Exodus as the holiness of the temple is emphasized, and as the temple is really emphasized as the center, in fact, as some people say, as the navel of the world. This is the spot where God is accessed. This is the place where God dwells. This whole building process reaches its climax in the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, finishing on the first day of the festival, the 15th day of the 7th month. This is significant because it's the same time that Haggai will stand up and give his famous prophecy about the greater glory of the temple that is yet to come. We know that that greater glory is fulfilled in the New Testament, but here in the Old Testament we see a great glory as the glory of God fills the temple to the point that the priests cannot go about their work. This effectively ends the Exodus because it means that the tabernacle is no longer needed. Now the tabernacle, which has been at Gibeon, has been replaced by the Ark of the Covenant in the temple in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is now the home of God, as God demonstrates that by filling this with the cloud, that cloud that had led Israel for so long. Now all Israel knows God lives in Jerusalem. This is God's home. In fact, the entire world knows this is God's house. This is where God dwells. This is where God is accessed. This is now where the Day of Atonement will take place. This is where all the festivals will take place. This is where Israel will come 3 times a year for the Passover, for the Feast of Pentecost, and the Feast of Booths. They will come to Jerusalem to celebrate. This is now the center of Israel's world. In fact, as Israel understood the world, this is the center of the world. Again, that idea almost of the temple being the navel or the belly button of the entire world. There are a couple lingering questions, though, from 1 Kings 5 through 9. One is, who's actually building the temple? We know that Hiram, the king of Tyre, is the one who provided the materials. We also know that Hiram, a half-Israelite, is the skilled man who will build a lot of the temple, and yet the text ambiguously refers to he. He built this, and he did this, and he did that, almost as though the text is giving Solomon credit for all of it, which in many cases seems to be the intent of the author of 1 Kings, that he is indeed making it seem like Solomon builds all of it. We also don't have an indication of who the high priest is, even though we know that Zadok and perhaps Abiathar, depending on the timing of Abiathar's removal, but Zadok is the high priest, and yet he's not mentioned at all. Instead, all of the emphasis again is on Solomon. We continue to see an emphasis upon the king acting in a priestly role.
And that's what we see in this passage here. Solomon is doing all of this through other agents, but Solomon is the one that is being highlighted. Solomon is the one that is being emphasized. Solomon is the one who is acting very much like a priest. And so we see Solomon as king taking control of the construction of the temple, even the appointment of Levites, much like his father David. And we see this not just in David and Solomon, but we will see this in all of the godly kings of Judah, that they are the ones who repair the temple, they're the ones who take care of the temple, they're the ones who establish worshipers, they're the ones who appoint the Levites to particular tasks. So even though the high priest has an important role, especially on the Day of Atonement, the emphasis really seems to be on the king, especially the king from the line of David, acting in what we might expect a high priest to act, offering sacrifices in many cases, giving a blessing to the people, even though we refer to it as the blessing of Aaron. Solomon is doing all of this, much like his father before him did, which sets a pattern that will take place in these other kings. So the writer of Kings is again harking all the way back to Exodus chapter 19, reminding us that the king of Israel is king of a kingdom of priests, and therefore the kings themselves are priests. Chronicles will make this more explicit, but we can even see it here in some of these ambiguities in 1 Kings 5 through 9, as the writer again is making it seem like Solomon is the one that is responsible.
1 Kings chapter 10 tells us of the glory of Solomon's kingdom and his continued rise to fame throughout the ancient world because of his wisdom. Even the Queen of Sheba has to come and see the glory of Solomon's kingdom and to hear his wisdom. The Queen of Sheba was from Ethiopia, from Cush, from that kingdom there, and was a very powerful entity and a very powerful kingdom in northeast Africa. Tradition on the Ethiopian side says that when the Queen of Sheba went back to her own country, she went back with more than just some insight into Solomon's kingdom. Instead, the kings and the queens that continued from her line actually traced their lineage back to Solomon, claiming that the Queen of Sheba had a little bun in the oven when she went back to Ethiopia. There's nothing in the text that suggests that, but then again, I wouldn't really put it past Solomon either. Unfortunately, Solomon's glory is the beginning of his downfall, because Solomon begins to collect those very things that he was not supposed to collect. He begins to collect money, he begins to collect horses. In fact, we're told explicitly that his horses, some 12 to 14,000 of them, are from Egypt, which is the very place that in Deuteronomy chapter 17 he was told not to collect horses from, not to go back to Egypt in order to get horses. And so here the writer of Kings is explicit in that's where these horses are coming from. Solomon makes silver as plentiful as the stones on the ground, which is great for the prosperity of Israel. But then as Solomon gets older, his heart begins to be taken away because he lives in such comfort. He's no longer dependent upon God, and his wives, which he also collects almost as much as he collects horses, begin to lead him astray. He begins to worship the other gods and goddesses of the surrounding areas. He worships Ashtoreth, also known as Astarte or Asherah. He also worships Chemosh and Molech and the other detestable gods of the area. He offers sacrifices to them. It doesn't say explicitly that he offers child sacrifices or the sacrifice of humans, which some of those gods, their worship entailed, but it does say that he built high places for them in order to please his wives. We're told that Solomon did not fully follow after the Lord his God. He did not follow him completely in his heart as he did before, suggesting that perhaps he still followed after God somewhat, that maybe this answers the question as to whether or not Solomon was still a believer. We also, though, have the indication that his heart turned away from God, which suggests that maybe he did completely turn away from worshiping the Lord his God, so that he was not still a believer. There's still great debate on that. Chronicles seems to wade in and suggest that Solomon was still a believer and that he did repent, but here in Kings we have no indication of that. We're only told about Solomon's idolatry. Because of that, we have the punishment of Solomon that begins in chapter 11 and goes in through chapter 12, and that being that God sends against Solomon several other nations. One of them is Hadad, the king of the Edomites. We're told in chapter 11 explicitly that Pharaoh so respects Hadad that Pharaoh gives Hadad one of Pharaoh's wife's sisters. This is pretty remarkable because earlier in 1 Kings chapter 3 and again in chapter 9, we're told that Pharaoh actually gave Solomon one of Pharaoh's daughters. It's remarkable because typically the daughters of Pharaoh don't leave Egypt. Even when there is a marriage alliance, that marriage alliance entails the daughter staying in Egypt. And yet we see Solomon in all of his glory actually building a palace for the daughter of Pharaoh, meaning that she at some point left Egypt and came to live with him. And now we're seeing the same thing with Hadad. Pharaoh even has shifted his allegiance from the Israelites and the love that he has for his daughter to now Hadad, king of the Edomites. Perhaps Pharaoh, playing the odds as it were, is still in allegiance with both, but at the very least he now also has an allegiance with the Edomites, which is going to create problems with Israel further down the line. Solomon has conflict with other marauding bands left over from the time of David, but most famously has a conflict with Jeroboam, and the story begins to read a little bit like the story of Saul and David, where Solomon understands that Jeroboam has been selected and anointed as the next king of Israel by a prophet, Ahijah, instead of Samuel, who anointed David, obviously since Samuel is dead. Ahijah tears a garment into 12 pieces, gives 10 of them to Jeroboam. When Solomon finds out about this, Solomon tries to kill Jeroboam, much like Saul trying to kill David. Jeroboam flees, and eventually will come back after Solomon dies. After Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam becomes the king of Israel, and Rehoboam is not anywhere near as wise as his father. He doesn't listen to his father's advisors when it comes to the time to tax the people. Instead, he listens to the young men. He so offends all the people of Israel that they rebel against him and go and leave and follow Jeroboam. Rehoboam decides to amass an army, and he gets ready to attack, and then he's told by a prophet, "Don't do this. These are your fellow Israelites, and this is from God. Be content with the 2 tribes that you have." From this point on, because of the sin of Solomon, there will be 2 nations in Israel. There will be the northern kingdom, often called Israel or Samaria, and there will be the southern kingdom known as Judah. It actually is technically Judah, Benjamin, parts of the Levites, but we still often refer to it as the southern kingdom, and the northern kingdom, 2 tribes in the south, 10 in the north. This will be the pattern until after the exile, and all of it goes back to the beginning of Saul's sin. Solomon's sin. Solomon is the one who worshipped other gods, and God has punished him by sending upon Israel this great unfolding of the enemies of God who are fighting against Judah. Jeroboam becomes one of those enemies of God, sadly, as we'll see in the next few chapters. Sadly, the split in the kingdom of Israel is not just a political split, but a religious split. Jeroboam realizes the problem of having all of his people go down to Jerusalem to worship God, so instead he sets up his own temples, his own shrines in Dan and Bethel, basically making an alternative to the worship of God in Jerusalem. He uses golden calves, reminiscent of Exodus chapter 32 and the golden calf there. It's possible that Jeroboam is borrowing from the religion of the Canaanites and the god El, spelled E-L, where El is pictured as a bull or sometimes riding on a bull. There's debate as to whether or not the bull is God or if it's the throne of God, similar to the way the Ark of the Covenant is not God but is the throne of God. Several of these deities, including El, are said to ride on a bull but are also called the bull. And so it is quite difficult to know which is which. Scholars go either way. It's probably not indicating Baal or Hadad, the god of the Phoenicians, because the Phoenicians have not yet influenced Israelite religion. The Baals, the little Baals, and the little Ashtoreths are simply local deities, local gods, kind of underlings as it were, but the main god of Hadad has not yet come into Israel. Baal worship, the worship of Hadad, will really begin in earnest when Jezebel marries King Ahab. But Jeroboam here is trying to create his own religion so that the people will follow in the northern tradition rather than in the southern tradition and not go down to Jerusalem. It's ironic then in 1 Kings 13 that a prophet from the southern kingdom goes to the northern kingdom, the reverse of what Jeroboam wanted to avoid, and goes and prophesies to the north, specifically to Jeroboam, saying that there will come a time when the worship of these golden calves will end. And indeed it will go on until that time foretold by this man of God. Josiah is foretold as the one who will come and desecrate these altars, taking the bones of those who used to offer sacrifices on the altars and instead offering their bones as sacrifices on the altars, completely desecrating them and destroying them. But the worship at Baal of Dan and Bethel will continue until that point, until Josiah stops it. So for the rest of the history of Israel, each of the Israelite kings will be referenced in relation to the sins of Jeroboam, and all the kings will continue them. In 1 Kings 14, we return to the stories of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and neither one is good. Jeroboam wants to worship other gods and also get wisdom and input from other gods. Rehoboam, as well, is worshiping other gods. We're reminded twice that Rehoboam's mother is an Ammonite, which is a serious problem. Rehoboam is not even fully Israelite, and yet he is king over all Israel. And because he's not fully Israelite, but also part Ammonite, he apparently worships other gods. This is a major negative for Rehoboam, so that even the southern kingdom of Judah is led astray. But there is hope, because in the northern kingdom we will never get a godly king, but in the south, after Rehoboam, we do get the occasional godly king who is like David. The Book of Kings uses a regnal formula to describe the kings that reigned in Judah and in Israel. The word regnal simply means king, so this is a king formula or a formula related to kings. In Judah, the kings reign in the capital city of Jerusalem. In Israel, they reign in the capital city of Tirzah until the reign of Omri, in which the capital city is switched to Samaria, which becomes simply the catch-all term for the northern kingdom, although used interchangeably with Israel or with Ephraim. You can see the two formulas in 1 Kings chapter 15 through 16, as those chapters speed at a pretty quick pace through the various kings in the north and the south. There are, though, different formulas that are found in the north than there are in the south, suggesting that the Book of Kings has used other sources to establish the description of the various kingdoms. In the south, we're always told who the mother of the king is. Of course, there are always exceptions, just as we saw with the formula in Judges, where there is a typical motif or formula used to describe each judge. Hence here there is a typical formula used to describe each king. We're told how long the king reigned, we're told who his mother is, and we're also told of how close he was to David. Did he follow in the footsteps of David? Was he like David in holiness? Did he follow in God's footsteps and do what God told him to do, or was he a wicked king? In the north, we typically see a description not of the connection to David, but instead of the connection to Jeroboam. Did the king maintain the sin of Jeroboam? For instance, Nadab is the son of Jeroboam, and we're told that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the ways of his father Jeroboam and committing the same sin his father had caused Israel to commit. We're told whether they are good or evil, but we're not told who the mother is. Instead, that particular part of the formula is reserved for the southern kings. Both of the north and the south are related to the question of holiness, but the formula is tied either to Jeroboam in the north and his sin, or to David in the south and his righteousness. So in that sense, the two formulas are very similar, but they diverge in terms of the person that is referenced. Again, we're told how many years that they reign, although there is some discussion over how the year is determined for the reign. Some people have suggested that the formulas worked slightly different, that being that if a king reigned in, say, December of one year, that whole year was counted as his first reign, whereas in another kingdom, if he began reigning in December, the first year would not be counted until the following December. All of this is an attempt to get the chronology of the kings to work, and in most cases it works just fine. However, there are some slight differences and some slight discrepancies within the accounts that make it a little more difficult to figure out how exactly the kings are reigning at the time that they are said to have reigned. So there are some differences between what is recorded for us and what even mathematically or consistently would work. But for the most part, the numbers are fairly accurate. There are different numbers occasionally given in various Greek editions, and sometimes those are compared between the Masoretic text and the Greek text. It's difficult to know which is the correct form per se. However, it seems as though the Masoretic text is more consistent in its dating and its dating practices, although it doesn't eliminate all of the problems. And so typically we rely upon the Masoretic text rather than the Septuagint to determine how many years a king reigned, keeping in mind that the number might be one or two off depending on how that particular king's reign is counted. Again, all of this is part of that formula and seems to have come from two separate documents. In fact, in some cases, the particular document that is used as the source document will actually be explicitly mentioned by the author of Kings. In other times, it is not mentioned, but it does give the impression that there is something being written elsewhere that communicates this information. In 1 Kings 17, we are introduced to Elijah. Elijah and Elisha. Elijah obviously comes first, and then Elisha. Elijah will eventually commission Elisha to be the prophet of Israel. It's fascinating, though, because Elijah performs miracles, as does Elisha in 2 Kings. It's very fascinating that this takes place because thus far we have not really seen a prophet performing miracles. Elijah is one of the first, and Elisha is one of the last. After this point, we don't really see prophets performing miracles. But here, at this particular point in Israel's history, we do see the working of miracles, as Elijah and Elisha do fairly miraculous signs, from making axe heads float, to purifying water, to calling out bears to maul children, just crazy things that take place. One of them that takes place is in 1 Kings 18, which is the battle of Elijah against Baal. We have already been told that Elijah prayed and that there was no rain. James mentions this in James chapter 5 in the New Testament, that it doesn't rain for 3 years because Elijah prayed that it would not. Here against Baal, Elijah has that great contest where fire comes from heaven and consumes his offering, but not those of the worshippers of Baal. Instead, the worshippers of Baal are killed, but that is not really the end of the process. We continue to see Baal worship in Israel, despite Elijah cleaning house, as it were. Elijah, at the end of that contest, asks God to send rain, and indeed God does. It's a very powerful, powerful story, as Elijah is contesting with Baal and demonstrating that God is the God of heaven. And yet in 1 Kings 19, Elijah is still very much terrified of the worshippers of Baal, still very much terrified of Jezebel, and despairing as a prophet, and wants to quit. And instead he goes to Mount Horeb, where we see almost a reoccurrence of the theophany that takes place with Moses, where Elijah actually hears the mouth of God speaking in a still small whisper. Elijah is very much reenacting that whole appearance of God to Moses in chapter 36 of the book of Exodus. So here Elijah is comforted and encouraged and goes immediately and finds his replacement, who is Elisha. It's a very interesting time again in Israel's history, as the prophets are functioning in very unique ways that we don't typically think of prophets functioning, and yet they are directly contesting the miracles, supposedly, of Baal, and demonstrating that actually the God of Israel is the one who performs miracles, not Baal. So this is part of why these miracles are so important. There's a direct contest between gods that is taking place. And Elijah is demonstrating that he is a true prophet as opposed to the prophets of Baal. This is part of that contest, that fight that's going on between God and Baal, a fight that eventually God will win, and a fight that here obviously God should win, but because of the influence of the king and queen who follow after Baal, the people as well are fickle and follow after Baal, continuing to trust in him rather than in God, even despite the contest in chapter 18. Even though they've seen the fire fall from heaven and consume the sacrifice of the Lord, so many of the people are still led astray to follow after Baal. 1 Kings chapter 19 and 20 introduces us to King Ahab. Ahab is one of the central figures of 1 Kings. It's fascinating when you think about it that here we have a report of all of these kings within Israel in both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and yet there are more chapters on Elijah, Elisha, and Ahab than anyone else in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, and Elijah and Elisha aren't even kings. They are prophets, which again suggests that perhaps our name for these books is not necessarily the most accurate name. Ahab is nowhere near as politically significant within the ancient Near East as his father Omri. Omri is the one who is recognized by most of the other kings at this time as being so powerful and so glorious. And yet, the Bible simply skips over Omri, barely mentioning anything he accomplished, other than that he moved the capital from Tirzah to Samaria, which is what the name of the northern kingdom will most often be referred to from this point on, Samaria. Ahab, though, is the focus of 1 Kings 20 and following, all the way up through the end of 1 Kings, where he will die. In 1 Kings chapter 20, Ahab disobeys God in a way that sounds very much like Saul. Ahab did the letter of the law, but completely missed the spirit of the law. He attacks Ben-Hadad and completely destroys Ben-Hadad's armies, and yet lets Ben-Hadad go. And a prophet comes along and tells Ahab that because he has let him go, God is going to require a life from Ahab. And eventually that's what will happen. Ahab's family will be wiped out. 1 Kings 21 is the very famous story of Naboth's vineyard. What's often overlooked, though, is at the end of the chapter, after being confronted, Ahab actually repents. And in his repentance, God says, I will actually bring all the destruction upon your house after you have died, so you will not have to see any of it, which is very merciful. Again, a reminder that anybody who repents, even someone as wicked as King Ahab, can indeed find the forgiveness of God. 1 Kings 22 is a recount of the battle that Ahab and King Jehoshaphat of Judah are going to fight together. It's a fascinating story because of the lying prophets who claim, at least Micah claims, that the lying spirit has come from God, and that the whole point of these lying spirits is to put Ahab to death, which is exactly what happens. Ahab is killed by what seems like a random arrow. It's not so random, because God was sovereignly in control of all of it. And yet we're left with, how can these prophets be lying to Ahab if they're from God, if they have these spirits from God? And I think the answer is that God does not view the truth the way that we tend to define it, in terms of, we often think of it as very black and white, which it is. It's either true or it's not true. And yet God is willing to use deceit, if you want to call it that, from people who should not otherwise expect the truth. There's no reason that Ahab should expect the truth from a group of false prophets. So, of course, God is going to allow false prophets to speak false words. And it shouldn't really surprise us then that God actually uses the deceit and the dishonesty of these prophets against Ahab. This makes perfect sense. So we shouldn't be as uncomfortable with the lying prophets as often we are. As soon as we see the word lying, all sorts of warning bells go off in our head and we think this must be wrong. But when we understand that God does not give truth to people who don't deserve or don't expect the truth, we begin to see it in a little bit better light. That God is actually giving Ahab exactly what Ahab should expect. He should expect falsity from false prophets. In the end, Micah is put in prison for prophesying and telling Ahab the truth, and again demonstrating that Ahab had no right to expect the truth because he hates it. He even says, Micah always prophesies against me. Well, yeah, because you're not really having a prophet to tell you what God says. You're having a prophet that just tells you what you want to hear. So of course God's going to send a lying spirit and do exactly what it is that you're expecting and what it is that you want. Micah, we're never told, gets out of prison, but Ahab does indeed die in battle, bringing to an end a very odd chapter of Israel's history. Again, the conflict between Ahab, Elijah, and Elisha taking up several chapters here in the book, but it does draw this to a close. Unfortunately, it doesn't draw it necessarily to a positive close, as the northern kingdom's going to continue to be wicked, but at least we get a little bit of a reprieve. 2 Kings chapter 1 transitions us into the book of 2 Kings, again remembering that the books are divided based on their length in the scrolls, not so much on the content of the book. That doesn't mean that we've randomly decided to divide them in any particular place, but that we have specific reasons for doing so. Book of 1 Kings ends with the death of Ahab, whereas 2 Kings starts with the reign of Ahab's son. Although we see here that Elijah is being as contested in chapter 1 of 2 Kings as he was by Ahab at the end of 1 Kings. We see a fascinating story of numerous men being roasted to death as they try to get Elijah to come down. Finally, one of them is smart enough to figure out that rather than telling Elijah what he should do, he should beseech Elijah to come down and spare his life, which Elijah does, and probably would have done had any of them been willing to ask. Elijah is reminding not only the men who come to call him down, but also the king of Israel that the prophets are not subject to the kings, but the other way around. The kings are subject to the word of the Lord, which comes by the prophets. This goes all the way back to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18, where we're reminded in chapter 17 that there are kings, but where we're reminded in chapter 18 that there are also priests and prophets. Those prophets are the ones by whom the word of the Lord comes. So we have here a demonstration of that very fact that Elijah says, I'm a prophet, I don't have to listen to you. The prophet certainly respects the king, but not when the king is demanding something that he has no right to demand. Elijah, in a sense, is putting the king in his place, as it were, unfortunately at the expense of these other men, but those other men certainly have the same thought as the king, of we just tell Elijah what the king says and Elijah has to obey. And instead Elijah says, nope, not so fast. It's the other way around. When I tell you what the word of God says, you have to obey. Unfortunately for Ahaziah, the word of the Lord here is, you're going to die, which is exactly what happens. So the emphasis in this first chapter is on Elijah's authority and the power of God's word, all of which then is conferred to Elisha in chapter 2. Elisha has been following Elijah for very, very many chapters here, but now we see the official commissioning as Elijah's power goes over to Elisha, and as we see Elijah being taken up into heaven by the flaming chariots of God. Elisha now will perform miracles and will carry on the work of Elijah with a double measure of his spirit, as Elisha asked. In 2 Kings chapter 5, we read about Naaman, the Aramean commander of armies, and his leprosy. By the end of the chapter, the leprosy will actually stick to Gehazi, the servant of Elisha. Gehazi goes and lies to Naaman. Naaman had tried to offer money and other things to Elisha in exchange for healing. Elisha had turned them all down. Gehazi, though, sees an opportunity, lies to Naaman and says, actually, we will take some of that money and those garments. Elisha tells Gehazi that Gehazi will have the leprosy of Naaman now for all of his succeeding generations, which indeed takes place. We also see in chapter 5, in verses 17 and 18, an admission by Naaman that he's going to have to go into a pagan temple to worship with his superior officer. In verse 19, Elisha says, go in peace, which would suggest that that is indeed okay and that he's forgiven, although some scholars take it the other way and say that this is Elisha basically avoiding answering the question, and basically saying to Naaman, Naaman, you're an idiot to think that it's going to be okay to go worship in a pagan temple when you're now claiming you worship the God of Israel. Scholars continue to debate this, and really either one could be defensible from the text, although I tend to lean a little bit more towards the idea that Elisha is saying you are indeed forgiven, which again, especially in light of New Testament teachings related to the sacrifice of meat offered to idols, is perplexing and rather odd. In fact, even seems somewhat contradictory. However, it does appear that that's what Elisha is telling Naaman, that yes, God understands when you have to bow down in a foreign temple because you're with your superior officer. In chapter 6, we see the situation go from worse to worst. We see what looks like the story of Solomon and the two women with their baby trying to figure out who the baby belongs to, Only here, instead of there being a dead child and an alive child and trying to figure out who the live child goes with, instead the mothers were in the process of eating the baby. They ate the one baby, and then when they went to eat the second baby, the mother hid it. This really shows how far Israel has declined since the days of Solomon, so that now in Samaria they're eating their children rather than trying to figure out who they belong to. However, by the end of the story, in chapter 7, we do see relief. We see a reprieve as the siege is lifted, the Arameans end up slaughtering each other, and the price of food drops drastically because there's so much of it, fulfilling a prophecy by Elisha that the captain who doubted that God could actually feed the people of Samaria is trampled to death in the gates. However, that doesn't mean that Israel begins to turn back to God, even though there's a reprieve. Instead, they continue to follow after false gods, foreign gods, and continue to worship the Baals. However, there is a little bit of a reprieve that takes place in chapter 7. In chapter 8, though, we find out about the various successions that are going to take place in Israel and in Judah, setting the stage for the destruction of the family of Ahab. We also see Hazael murdering Ben-Hadad. There's a lot of Ben-Hadads in Aram. Ben-Hadad is the commander of the armies of Hazael, and Hazael is also serving a Ben-Hadad. So we have two Ben-Hadads. Hazael here will murder Ben-Hadad, but eventually a different Ben-Hadad will take over for Hazael. So you're forgiven if you're slightly confused by this. But here, in this particular instance, Elisha is telling the king of Aram is going to die, not because he's going to die of the disease that he has, but because he's going to be murdered by Hazael, which creates a very interesting situation because it sounds very much like God, through Elisha, just told Hazael to go murder his master. It's again a very perplexing situation, as Hazael is taking matters into his own hands and becoming king. Eventually, like I said, we'll see a Ben-Hadad replace him. Chapter 8 also continues to tell us about some interaction with the Shunammite, the one whom he was living with. She has lost her land and instead gets it back. What's interesting in chapter 8 is that Gehazi is back in the picture, and yet in chapter 5 we saw that he had leprosy. This is telling us that these chapters are not in chronological order, but again, just as we've seen in other books, they're in a logical order in order to make a theological point. We needed to have that story of Naaman earlier on to highlight the oddity of Naaman coming and being delivered of his leprosy, and yet also making war against the very nation that delivered him. So even though Naaman is thrilled to death that the God of Israel healed him, it would appear that he continues to fight against Israel in the coming years. Chapters 9 through 12 of 2 Kings are one of the larger chunks in the book. They take us from Jehu to Joash, a number of kings, a number of generations here, at least 4 generations in the north, several generations in the south. Jehu slaughters the family of Ahab. Also precipitates the situation in Judah where we have a queen, Queen Athaliah, as she murders off all of her grandsons in order to reign as queen. Jehu having killed her son when he killed all the descendants of Ahab in the north. Jehu will continue to serve God, and yet he's not totally righteous because he doesn't remove the golden calves that Jeroboam set up. After several generations, Joash, the great-great-grandson of Jehu, will come to power. In 2 Kings 13, we read that there's continued decline in the northern kingdom. Not that this really surprises us, as we've continued to see decline again and again and again. We do see Elisha actually dying in chapter 13, which just adds to the fact that there is decline in Israel. Hazael, who Elisha had appointed as king over Aram, is continuing to oppress Israel. And yet we're told that the Lord was gracious to Israel and was unwilling to destroy them or banish them from his presence. Although that is coming. That's going to happen. We read at the end of chapter 13 that Ben-Hadad is the son of Hazael. a different Ben-Hadad again from the Ben-Hadad that Hazael murdered. We also read that 3 times that King Jehoash captured some of the cities that had been taken by Hazael. Jehoash is beginning a transition in Israel's history of a time of prosperity, a time of real flourishing. However, this is going to be short-lived. It really reaches its peak in chapter 14 with the reign of King Jeroboam II. This is really the high point in the northern kingdom's history in terms of their prosperity, and yet from here to the end, it's going to be pretty much downhill. This is really a reprieve in the continued decline, in that we're not seeing the results of the decline, and yet we are still declining. So it's not a reprieve in the sense that we've stopped declining spiritually. We are still most certainly declining spiritually, but we're not seeing the consequences of that. And yet we find out that it's being stored up, and because of that, we're going to eventually reach the end. And yet we're getting these reprieves here that are trying to get Israel's attention. We saw the reprieve under Jehoash. We find another reprieve here in chapter 14 with Jeroboam II. The Lord had said in verse 27 that he would not blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, and so he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash. And yet, again, we are headed towards the end fairly quickly. In chapter 15, really through chapter 17, we are rushing towards the end. We do have some notes on what's going on in Judah, and yet as well as things are going in Judah with the reign of Ahaz, although Ahaz will eventually set up a foreign altar to the Lord in the temple. But aside from some of those things, Judah is actually flourishing and staying fairly focused on God spiritually. However, Israel in the north is not, and by the end of chapter 17, they have indeed gone off into exile under the reign of the Assyrians, having been taken out in 722 BC. This then is the end of the story of the north, and yet the story of the south will continue for several more chapters. 2 Kings 18 through 21 is another chunk in the book of 2 Kings dealing with Hezekiah. Hezekiah is well known for several miraculous events that take place. The destruction of the Assyrian army under Sennacherib or Sennacherib, as well as the sundial moving backwards, or the steps moving backwards, as a sign that Hezekiah is going to live another 15 years. As miraculous as the siege and the lifting of the siege of the Assyrians is, we forget the fact that pretty much every single town in Judah was destroyed with the exception of Jerusalem. Lachish, which was not that far, is very famously depicted in a mural by the Assyrians showing their destruction of the land of Israel. Not sure that they really thought of it as 2 kingdoms. They kind of seem to think of it all as the same, and they wipe it all out until they come to Jerusalem, and then God preserves them. We need to keep in mind that for a long time, the Israelites actually served the Assyrians, and it's under Hezekiah that they begin to revolt because they trust in God to save them. And God does save them, but there's a lot of destruction that takes place in Judah before that salvation actually comes. We see basically Sennacherib coming and mocking God, and then Hezekiah turning in faith to God and saying, "Did you hear this?" God says yes. Isaiah says that God is going to deliver Israel, and that's exactly what he does. Again, in chapter 20, we read about the boil that Hezekiah has, of which he's going to die, and yet he cries out to God and asks to be saved, and he is indeed spared for a time. We also see some envoys from Babylon. At the time, Marduk-Baladan is the king of Babylon. He comes and he takes a look at everything that's going on in Israel, and Hezekiah is happy to show him. And yet a prophet tells him that actually, eventually, the people are going to go into Babylon. Although Hezekiah thinks that's not so bad because he figures he's going to be dead by the time that happens. One other interesting fact that's mentioned at the end of chapter 20 is that Hezekiah made a pool and a tunnel to bring water into the city. You can actually go to Israel and tour this particular tunnel if you so desire. What's really fascinating, though, is that Hezekiah has a son named Manasseh, who will be the most wicked king in Israel. And we find out about Manasseh in chapter 21. We don't see anything good come out of Manasseh, although we do find out that Manasseh will repent, although we find that out from the book of Chronicles. As chapter 21 ends, it just seems to be bad, bad, and more bad. But then in chapter 22, we get Josiah. And actually, 22 and 23 will tell us about Josiah. And one wonders what would have happened had Josiah remained the king of Israel. He's the one that finds the book of the law in the temple because he's having the temple repaired. And yet, unfortunately, the Egyptians are going through Israel on their way to Carchemish to join with the Assyrians to fight against the Babylonians, where both the Assyrians and the Egyptians will get their butts kicked by the Babylonians, which pretty much ends Egypt's domination of the western part of the Levant and the ancient Near East, the land of Israel. We also see Israel going out and fighting against Pharaoh Necho as he's making his way to Carchemish. Necho warns him not to, and yet he does, and Necho ends up killing Josiah. One again wonders what would have happened if Josiah had continued to live. Would he have continued his reforms? Would he have led Israel in righteousness? It's hard to tell, because as soon as he dies and as soon as they begin to set up other kings, Israel quickly goes back and follows after the foreign gods that they were serving. Jehoahaz is the oldest son of Josiah. Jehoahaz becomes the king, and he doesn't reign very long, only 3 months. Pharaoh Necho is on his way back from Carchemish, having been defeated. He goes into Jerusalem, takes Jehoahaz, puts him in chains, and takes him to Egypt. Pharaoh Necho then makes Eliakim, the son of Josiah, the second son, king in place of Josiah, and changes Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. Jehoahaz, though the oldest, is carried off to Egypt, and there he dies. Jehoiakim continues to serve under Pharaoh Necho's suzerain relationship. Basically, Israel is a vassal state to the Egyptians, with Pharaoh Necho being the suzerain or the feudal lord, as it were. Jehoiakim will reign for 11 years. After he dies, Nebuchadnezzar comes and invades. Jehoiakim dies, and Jehoiakim is his son, succeeds him. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, comes and takes Jehoiakim captive to Babylon and takes another descendant of Josiah's family, Mattaniah. Mattaniah is actually Jehoiakim's uncle, so this would be Josiah's brother. Nebuchadnezzar changes the name of Mattaniah to Zedekiah, which is a very unusual name choice since that means Yahweh is righteous, which makes us question how much Nebuchadnezzar really understands about what's going on. He seems to have more insight than perhaps we would assume from a Babylonian king. I would guess that's from the influence of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel. Zedekiah will reign in Israel for 11 years. He shows up quite a bit in the book of Jeremiah. Zedekiah will revolt against King Nebuchadnezzar foolishly. Not really sure why he thought that was a good idea, but that's what he does. Even though Jeremiah keeps telling him he needs to actually surrender to the Babylonians, Zedekiah continues to fight against Nebuchadnezzar, and eventually Nebuchadnezzar will sack the entire city of Jerusalem. They will break down the walls, they will burn the temple, they will take everybody in captivity off to Babylon in exile. You would think this is where the book is going to end, because we don't hear much about a return, the way that we hear at the end of the book of 2nd Chronicles, but we do have a positive note. At the very end of the book, we're told that Jehoiakim comes out of prison and sits at the king's table, which on the one hand is somewhat shaming, because it shows he's been defeated. On the other hand, it's also a positive because he's no longer in prison. Eventually, Jehoiakim, it appears, will die of old age. One wonders, because this is the ending of the book, if the writer of Kings is saying, here's an element of hope, but is it also possible that the writer of Kings does not yet know of a return from exile? And so he's in exile, telling us about the continued exile, but telling us that there's this small element of hope. Jehoiakim has been replaced from prison. Maybe there is hope after all. And yet, as the book of Second Kings ends, the people are still in captivity in Babylon. The Assyrian destination of several of the tribes of Israel. Israel's no longer to be seen. They're mixed in completely. There are Samaritans that have taken the place of Israel in Samaria, half breeds of all the other nations that are mixed in with Israel here in Samaria. And we have the rest of the tribes, really the two tribes, Judah, parts of Benjamin, and Levi, that are in Babylon. It seems as though this is the end and there's no hope, and yet we know the rest of the story and we know that they will eventually return. But it is a reminder that God is serious when he says that there's a punishment. There is a serious punishment here. There is the exile exactly as he foretold. They thought that would never happen, and yet it's exactly how it happens. So really, in the book of Second Kings, we see the book start bad and just continually get worse and worse and worse, except with some of these reprieves. So there is a reprieve even at the end of the book. There is hope, a reminder that God is still active and God is still at work. And yet Israel doesn't have a whole lot of hope that this is going to turn out well for them. They're in exile, and they don't even know that there's ever going to be a chance to go back. For all most of Israel knows, this is the end. They will forever be Babylonians, especially when Jeremiah writes them a letter in Jeremiah 29 and says they should seek the good of the city of Babylon because they're going to be there for a while. We don't find out until later on in the book of Daniel that Daniel is the one who figures out that it's only going to be 70 years. And yet here in Second Kings, we don't even know that yet, that it's only going to be 70 years. Instead, we think that this is permanent. So it really ends on a low note, and were it not for Ezra and Nehemiah and really the end of Second Chronicles, we would continue on that low note, thinking that God has completely abandoned Israel.